Tonight's story comes from the backcountry, where a hiker's calm weekend trip twisted into a nightmare the moment the fog rolled in. He was experienced. He knew the trail. But the fog didn't behave like weather. It moved with intention, thick, heavy, swallowing sound and space until he couldn't tell where he'd come from or how far he was drifting off the path. Then his radio crackled alive. Not with dispatch, not with another hiker, but with a voice whispering his own coordinates. Coordinates he never spoke out loud. And that was only the beginning. My name is Daniel Rowe. I am a records analyst contracted by a regional interagency task group that handles unresolved missing persons cases deemed inactive by local authorities. My role is not investigative in the traditional sense. I do not interview witnesses or walk search grids. I am assigned to files, paper, scanned reports, microfilm, and archival recordings, tasked with identifying patterns that were missed or dismissed at the time. On the morning this incident began, I was formally assigned a backlog spanning more than 60 years of disappearances linked by a thin and largely ignored thread to a single forest road that no longer appears on modern maps. The assignment came through at 08:12 a.m. via a secure internal server. The file designation was unremarkable, but the volume was not. 37 cases across multiple decades, jurisdictions and agencies, all tagged with an outdated roading code, referencing an access road labeled simply as F12 Spur. There was no accompanying explanation. Roads are frequently decommissioned, renamed, or absorbed into wilderness areas, and unresolved cases often share geographic overlap without deeper meaning. That was my assumption when I opened the first file. The earliest case dated back to 1954. A forestry technician failed to report back after a routine inspection. The final log entry placed him approximately 3 miles past the F12 junction. There was no follow-up documentation explaining where that junction was. Only a note that the road was no longer maintained. The technician's vehicle was found parked neatly along a gravel turnout. The keys were missing. There were no signs of struggle. This description repeated itself with unsettling consistency as I progressed through the files. By mid-morning, I had cataloged 7 cases. Different decades. Different victims. Similar language. The same phrasing appeared again and again in the reports: no sign of distress, vehicle secured, personal effects left behind. In several instances, search teams reported that the road terminated sooner than expected, or that it did not align with survey maps. One report from the late 1970s included a hand-drawn sketch of the road's supposed route, overlaid with a typed note stating that aerial reconnaissance failed to locate it. At 11:03 a.m., I accessed a digitized map archive to cross-reference historical Forest Service layouts. The road appeared on maps from the 1940s through the early 1960s, then vanished entirely. It was not marked as closed or reclaimed. It was simply gone, replaced by an uninterrupted stretch of green. Modern satellite imagery showed dense, mature forest where the road should have been, but tree growth patterns suggested something else. The canopy line was subtly uneven, forming a narrow corridor that did not match natural regrowth. I should have stopped there. Pattern recognition does not require field confirmation. My task was to flag anomalies, not pursue them. But the assignment notes included a single sentence at the end of the file summary. Field verification authorized if deemed necessary. That authorization was rarely granted. It implied that someone else had noticed what I was noticing. At 12:17 p.m., I requested access to a government vehicle and sent out a standard issue GPS unit, audio recorder, and camera. The forest was less than an hour's drive from the regional office. I told myself I would locate the approximate area, confirm that the road no longer existed, and return with updated documentation. That was the extent of my plan. The drive was uneventful. The main highway transitioned into a 2-lane state road, then into a narrower forest road. Cell reception degraded gradually, not abruptly. The GPS continued to function, though it no longer displayed road names, only contour lines and coordinates. At 1:41 p.m., I reached the point where the archived maps indicated the F12 junction should have been. There was nothing there. No signpost. No clearing. Just trees pressing close to the asphalt, their branches forming a partial canopy overhead. I parked on the shoulder and stepped out. The forest was quiet in a way that felt procedural rather than peaceful. No wind, no insects. The silence had structure, like a room waiting to be occupied. I activated the audio recorder out of habit and noted the time and location. As I scanned the tree line, I noticed a subtle break in the undergrowth directly opposite the road. Not a trail, but a depression, as if something long and straight had once pressed the earth down and never fully released it. I followed it on foot. The ground dipped gently, and after less than 50 yards, the trees parted just enough to reveal gravel. Old gravel, embedded deep into the soil, darkened with age, but unmistakable. A road, narrower than modern standards, with no shoulder and no visible maintenance, but intact. My GPS did not register it. The device showed me standing in the middle of undeveloped forest. I documented the location with photographs and spoke my observations aloud for the recorder. The road extended forward in a straight line, vanishing into shadow. It did not curve to accommodate terrain. It did not rise or fall naturally. It cut through the forest with quiet indifference, as if the land had been instructed to move aside. At 2:06 p.m., I made the decision that would later be scrutinized by people who were not there. I stepped onto the road. The air felt cooler immediately. Not by much, but enough to register. The forest on either side seemed denser now, the trees closer together, their trunks aligned in a way that suggested planning rather than growth. I walked slowly, counting my steps, noting landmarks. After 10 minutes, I stopped and turned around. The road behind me looked the same as it had when I entered it, but the opening back to the main road was gone, not obscured, not hidden, gone. The gravel continued uninterrupted into the forest in both directions. I told myself that perspective can shift in unfamiliar terrain. I advanced another 100 yards and checked my GPS again. The screen flickered briefly before returning to the same static coordinates. The compass needle spun once, then settled, pointing straight ahead. At 2:34 p.m., I noticed the first vehicle. It was parked along the side of the road, partially sunken into the gravel. An older model sedan. Paint faded, tires long since deflated. Moss had begun to creep up the doors. The license plate was from the early 1980s. The driver's side door was closed. The windows were intact. Inside, on the passenger seat, lay a folded map. I did not touch it. I photographed it and moved on. More vehicles followed. Not clustered, but spaced evenly, as if parked intentionally at intervals. A pickup truck from the 1960s. A station wagon. A compact car I recognized from one of the case files. None showed signs of damage. None appeared to have been abandoned in haste. Each one felt paused rather than left behind. The light began to change around 3:15 p.m., not dimming exactly, but flattening, as if the shadows had lost depth. I checked my watch repeatedly. Time continued to pass normally. My breathing sounded louder than it should have. Every footstep echoed slightly, though the road's surface should have absorbed sound. At 3:42 p.m., I heard a noise ahead of me. It was not a voice. It was the sound of movement, measured and unhurried, coming from somewhere beyond the reach of the road's straight line. I stopped walking. The sound continued. Gravel shifting under weight. One step, then another. Approaching but never closer. I called out, identified myself, and stated my purpose. My voice felt thin, stretched too far. The sound stopped. I did not wait for it to resume. I turned and began walking back the way I believed I had come. The road did not change. The vehicles did not reappear in the same order. My GPS remained fixed. At 4:18 p.m., I realized I had been walking for over an hour, without reaching the forest opening. The audio recorder was still running. I spoke into it, steady and formal, documenting everything I could. The silence listened. At 4:53 p.m., the sound of footsteps returned, this time behind me. They matched my pace exactly. I did not turn around. I continued forward because stopping felt worse than moving. The sound behind me remained perfectly synchronized with my own steps, gravel responding to weight that mirrored mine without variation. When I slowed, it slowed. When I stopped, it stopped. There was no breath, no stumble, no irregularity that would suggest another human body reacting independently. It was imitation stripped of effort. I reminded myself to document. At 5:01 p.m., I spoke clearly into the recorder, noting auditory mimicry consistent with perceived pursuit, though no visual confirmation was present. Saying it aloud steadied me. Professional language has a way of placing distance between a situation and the person trapped inside it. I forced myself to turn. The road behind me was empty. It stretched straight and narrow, gravel unbroken, forest pressing in on both sides with identical density. No vehicles, no footprints, no movement. The silence returned immediately, thick enough to register as pressure. I stood there longer than I should have, waiting for something to contradict what my eyes were telling me. Nothing did. When I resumed walking, the footsteps did not return. By 5:26 p.m., the light had shifted again. The sky above the road was still visible through gaps in the canopy, but it no longer suggested late afternoon. There was no warmth in it, no sense of angle or direction. It was light without a source, evenly distributed, as if time had stalled between moments. I checked my watch. It was still advancing. I felt hunger, thirst, fatigue. My body insisted that the day was moving forward, even if the world around me disagreed. Another vehicle appeared ahead of me, this one different from the others. A Forest Service truck, older model, white paint flaking off in sheets. The insignia on the door was barely legible but familiar. I recognized the unit number from one of the files. This truck belonged to a ranger reported missing in 1992. According to the case notes, he had radioed in confusion about a road that would not end. The driver's side door was open. I approached slowly, every instinct warning me against closing the distance, but the alternative, walking past without looking, felt like a greater violation. Inside the cab, the interior was intact. No signs of struggle. The radio unit was still mounted to the dash. I turned it on. Static burst from the speaker, loud enough to make me flinch. I adjusted the volume, cycling through channels out of habit rather than hope. At first, there was nothing but interference. Then, faintly, a voice. It was distorted, stretched thin by decades of decay and signal loss, but the cadence was unmistakable. A man speaking carefully, as if choosing words under stress. He was repeating a location description, over and over, correcting himself each time. The coordinates never changed, but his confidence did. The transmission ended abruptly with a sharp click, followed by silence. I turned the radio off. I did not check the back of the truck. I knew what I would find if I did. Instead, I stepped away and continued down the road, documenting the encounter aloud. My voice shook despite my efforts to control it. The recorder captured everything, including the moments where I stopped speaking, because there was nothing left to say that felt true. At 6:04 p.m., the forest began to change. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have been obvious if I had not been watching for it. The trees grew closer together, their branches arching higher over the road. The undergrowth thinned, replaced by bare earth that sloped gently away from the gravel. The road itself appeared smoother here, less eroded, as if maintained by something that understood its purpose, but not its origin. I became aware, gradually, that I could no longer hear my own footsteps clearly. The gravel still shifted beneath my boots, but the sound was muted, absorbed almost immediately. The world felt padded, insulated from consequence. When I spoke, my voice did not echo. It simply stopped, as if cut off at a fixed distance. That was when I realized I could hear breathing. It was not close. It was not far. It existed everywhere at once. A low, steady intake and release that blended with the ambient silence until I focused on it. Once I did, I could not stop hearing it. It did not change when I stopped walking. It did not change when I moved faster. It was not following me. It was part of the road. I told myself this was stress-induced auditory distortion, isolation fatigue, and prolonged exposure to unfamiliar stimuli can produce convincing sensory artifacts. I repeated that explanation internally until the words lost meaning. At 6:37 p.m., I found the first personal item. A wristwatch lay on the gravel near the edge of the road. The glass was cracked, but the hands still moved. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to a college student who disappeared in 2008 while driving home from a camping trip. The watch had been listed among the items he was wearing when last seen. It should have been on his wrist. I did not pick it up. I photographed it and moved on. More items appeared as I walked. A shoe, a set of keys, a folded jacket placed neatly on a low branch, as if set aside deliberately. None of them showed signs of damage consistent with violence or haste. They felt curated, arranged with care rather than discarded. The road narrowed further. At 7:11 p.m., I reached a section where the gravel gave way to compacted dirt. The forest closed in until the trees were nearly flush with the road's edges. I became acutely aware of the space behind me again, not because I heard anything, but because the absence of sound felt intentional. I resisted the urge to turn. I asked, out loud, what it wanted. The question slipped out before I could stop it. It felt foolish the moment it left my mouth, a human instinct to assign agency where none should exist. The forest did not respond. The breathing continued, unchanged. Then the road ahead shifted. It did not bend. It did not curve. It simply ended, abruptly, at a wall of trees so dense they appeared fused together. The surface of the road pressed into the roots, stopping short as if cut off mid-thought. There was no clearing, no continuation, no space to step through. I stood there staring, trying to reconcile the impossibility of what I was seeing. Roads do not end like that. They erode. They fade. They are reclaimed slowly, imperfectly. This was different. This was termination. Behind me, the breathing grew louder. I turned. The road was gone. Not behind me, beneath me. The ground where gravel had been moments before was now forest floor, soft with needles and soil. The trees stood where the road should have been, identical to the ones ahead. I was standing in a corridor that no longer existed, held in place by memory alone. My GPS finally changed. The screen flickered, then displayed coordinates I did not recognize. They did not correspond to any known grid system I was familiar with. The compass needle spun wildly, then snapped into alignment, pointing directly at me. At 7:46 p.m., the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. I stood still because the alternative was to move without direction, and that felt like consent. The forest around me no longer suggested as I could navigate. It felt like a diagram that had been folded incorrectly, edges overlapping where they should not. When I shifted my weight, the ground responded softly, absorbing the motion without echo or resistance. The absence of sound was so complete that my own heartbeat felt intrusive. At 7:49 p.m., I spoke again, quietly, into the recorder. I stated my name, my role, and the last confirmed time. My voice sounded distant to my own ears, as if traveling through a medium thicker than air. I noted the disappearance of the road, the alteration of terrain, and the anomalous GPS behavior. I avoided speculation. I focused on observation. That discipline was all I had left. I attempted to retrace my steps using memory rather than landmarks. After 10 paces, the trees ahead of me separated just enough to suggest passage. It was not a trail. It was an allowance. I took it. The forest corridor extended forward, in a straight line, no wider than the road had been, bordered by trees that stood unnaturally upright. Their branches did not cross the space above me. The canopy remained open, revealing a sky that had finally darkened into something recognizable as evening. Stars were visible, but they did not match any configuration I knew. They felt arranged rather than distant. As I walked, the breathing returned. It was closer now, no longer ambient. It rose and fell with a rhythm that did not match mine. I could feel it more than hear it. A pressure against the back of my neck, like standing near a large animal just outside the range of sight. I kept my eyes forward. I did not turn. I had learned that the road responded to attention. At 8:14 p.m., the corridor opened into a clearing. The vehicles were all there. Every car, truck, and van I had seen along the road was arranged in a wide circle, headlights facing inward, engines long dead. The clearing itself was unnaturally level, the forest retreating just enough to accommodate the assembly. In the center stood a single wooden post, weathered and splintered, with no signage attached. People stood beside the vehicles. They were not moving. They were not facing me. Each stood with their back to the clearing's center, hands at their sides, posture neutral. They did not appear injured. They did not appear distressed. They appeared paused. I recognized several of them immediately. Faces from case files. Photographs taken decades apart, now present together in the same space, unchanged by time. Clothing styles varied, but their condition did not. No aging. No decay. They were preserved impressions of moments that never concluded. I stopped at the edge of the clearing. The breathing ceased the instant I did. One of the figures moved. It was a small motion, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. A shift of weight. a tilt of the head. Then another figure did the same. The movement spread slowly around the circle, not synchronized, but deliberate, as if something were testing responsiveness. I felt a pull then, not physical, but conceptual. An urge to step forward, to take a place among them, to align myself with the pattern that had been waiting. I refused. I stated, out loud, that I was leaving. I announced my intent to return to the main road, to exit the forest, to document the site with external authorities. The words felt ceremonial, less like a plan and more like a declaration of principle. The figures turned. They did not turn all the way, only enough to show profile. Their faces were calm. Their eyes were open. They were looking past me, not at me, focused on something behind my shoulder. I did not look. The GPS vibrated in my hand. The screen updated again, this time displaying coordinates that were familiar. Latitudes and longitudes consistent with the region I knew. The compass needle stabilized, pointing to my left. For the first time since entering the road, the device behaved as it should have. I took one step in the indicated direction. The clearing shuddered. Not violently, not dramatically. It was more like a collective adjustment, as if the environment were recalibrating a variable it had not anticipated. The figures stiffened. The vehicle's headlights flickered. Though no power source remained, the wooden post in the center cracked down the middle with a sharp, final sound. I ran. I did not follow the corridor. I did not follow any visible path. I ran in the direction the GPS indicated, pushing through undergrowth that resisted me in ways the road never had. Branches snagged my clothing. Roots caught my boots. The forest felt suddenly alive with consequence, each movement answered by sound and friction. Behind me, something moved quickly. It no longer matched my pace. It exceeded it. I did not turn. I focused on forward motion, on breath, on the weight of my body as proof that I still occupied it. The breathing grew ragged, uneven, no longer controlled. It sounded frustrated. At 8:37 p.m., I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto asphalt. I collapsed onto the shoulder of the state road, lungs burning, hands shaking uncontrollably. The forest behind me was silent, dark, and unremarkable. No corridor, no clearing. No indication that anything had ever existed beyond the tree line. A passing vehicle stopped. The driver asked if I was injured. I told him I had gotten lost. He offered to call for help. I accepted. Authorities arrived within 30 minutes. I gave a statement that omitted nothing and explained nothing beyond what I could support with evidence. Search teams returned to the location before midnight. They found no road, no vehicles, no clearing. Only forest consistent with satellite imagery and land surveys. My equipment was intact. The audio recorder contained everything I had spoken, including the sounds I could not explain. The GPS unit retained the anomalous coordinate logs. Both were confiscated for review. I was released at 11:58 p.m. The assignment was at 12:03 a.m., reclassified as resolved due to clerical error. The files referencing F-12 Spur were removed from the archive. My access credentials were downgraded the following morning. I have not returned to that forest. Sometimes when I review old maps for unrelated cases, I find a faint line where no road should be. It never appears twice in the same place. It never stays long enough to be captured. And when I notice it, I feel an immediate and overwhelming sense that I have been noticed in return. My name is Caleb Norton. I am writing this as a formal account of an incident that occurred on a single day, during a solo hike I undertook in early autumn. I have no history of mental illness, no record of hallucinations, and no prior belief in anything beyond what can be documented and explained. What I encountered that day followed every rule of reality I understood, which is precisely why it has stayed with me. I was not lost. I was not reckless. I was hiking a documented, maintained trail that appears on maps, park brochures, and ranger databases. What I found should not have existed at all. I began the hike just after sunrise. The trailhead parking lot was empty except for my vehicle and a ranger service truck that looked like it had been there overnight. The air was cold enough to fog my breath, but not uncomfortable. I signed the trail register, noted my planned route and return time, and started walking. I remember feeling calm, focused, grounded. This was not my first long hike, and nothing about that morning felt unusual. The forest was quiet in the way forests usually are at that hour, with distant birds and the low creak of trees, shifting as temperatures rose. About 3 hours in, I noticed the first thing that didn't quite fit. The trail was in good condition, clearly maintained, but there were fresh boot prints ahead of me that didn't match the kind usually left by day hikers. The tread was deeper, heavier, as if whoever made them had been carrying significant weight. That alone wasn't alarming. Backpackers often start early. I assumed I'd catch up to someone eventually. The trail followed a gradual incline along a ridge before dipping into a narrow valley. That was where I smelled smoke. At first it was faint, barely distinguishable from the damp, earthy scent of fallen leaves. But within a few minutes it became unmistakable. Wood smoke, fresh, active. I stopped walking and listened. I expected to hear voices. The crackle of a fire, the clink of cookware. There was nothing. The forest had gone still again, as if sound itself had decided to hold back. I continued cautiously, calling out once, then again. No response. When the trail curved around a stand of fir trees, I saw the campsite. It was set just off the trail, tucked into a shallow clearing that looked intentionally chosen. A tent stood upright, properly staked, its fabric clean and intact. A backpack leaned against a log. A pair of boots sat neatly side by side near the tent entrance. There was a fire ring with a small flame still burning inside it. Not embers. Flame. The firewood stacked nearby was dry and neatly split. A metal pot rested over the fire, and when I stepped closer, I felt heat against my face. The campsite was not abandoned. It was active. Lived in. Occupied. I called out again, louder this time, introducing myself. Still no answer. I took another step forward, and that was when the wrongness set in fully. The fire was warm, but the air around the campsite felt stale, like it had been sealed off from the rest of the forest. The birds I'd heard earlier were gone. Even the wind seemed reluctant to pass through the clearing. I knew the rules. You don't approach an occupied campsite without making your presence known. You don't touch other people's gear. You don't assume something is wrong unless there are clear signs. But everything about that place felt suspended in a moment that shouldn't have lasted. I backed away slightly and reached for my phone to check service. No signal, which wasn't unusual, but the time caught my attention. It was just after noon. According to my pace, it should have been closer to 11. I brushed the thought aside and focused on what I could verify. The backpack had a name stitched into the shoulder strap. Not a brand, a name. Daniel Reeves. The moment I read it, I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. I didn't know him personally, but I knew the name. 10 years earlier, I'd read about a missing hiker with that exact name while researching long-distance trails. The article had included a photo. I remembered it because of how ordinary the man looked. Mid-30s, short beard, neutral smile, the kind of face that blends into a crowd. I told myself it was coincidence. Names repeat. Memories distort. But my hands were shaking as I stepped closer to the tent. The zipper was partially open. Inside, I could see a sleeping bag laid out, a headlamp resting on top, a folded map near the entrance. Everything was arranged with care. There was no dust, no moisture, no sign of decay. The sleeping bag was warm when I pressed my fingers against it, as if someone had just stood up moments ago. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. Every instinct I had was telling me that this was not something I was meant to understand. But another part of me, the part that believes reality is consistent and accountable, needed confirmation. I needed proof that I wasn't misremembering. I stepped back from the tent and looked around for anything that might date the campsite. Food packaging, equipment models, something. Near the fire ring, I found a small notebook. It was tucked into a plastic sleeve to protect it from moisture. I hesitated before opening it, fully aware that I was crossing a line. Then I told myself that if someone was missing, and I had stumbled onto their camp, it was my responsibility to document it. The first page listed the same name, Daniel Reeves. Below it was a date written in neat, careful handwriting. The date was 10 years ago, the same year he'd gone missing. The entries that followed were mundane. Notes about weather, distances covered, observations about trail conditions. Nothing alarming, nothing that suggested distress. The final entry ended mid-sentence. I checked the fire again. It crackled softly, responding to my presence as if it were any ordinary campfire. I could feel the heat through my boots. This was not a preserved site. This was not a reconstruction. This was a living moment that had no right to be alive. I heard a sound then. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of the trail. I froze, every muscle locked, heart pounding hard enough that I was sure whoever was approaching could hear it. I told myself that this was good, that it meant there was a rational explanation, that Daniel Reeves was not missing, not dead, not frozen in time, that he was just another hiker, unaware of the decade that had passed beyond his campsite. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing. I turned to face the sound, ready to speak, to apologize, to explain. What I saw standing there made it impossible to finish any of those thoughts. The man was dressed for a hike that no longer existed. His clothes were clean but outdated. His gear unfamiliar in a way that suggested age rather than damage. He looked exactly like the photograph I remembered. Exactly the same age. The same expression. He was breathing. His chest rose and fell steadily. His eyes focused on me with mild confusion, as if I were the one out of place. Neither of us spoke. The fire popped softly between us, the only sound grounding the moment in something physical. I became acutely aware that every second passed without explanation made the situation more unstable. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, he took a step forward. That was when I noticed that his boots did not disturb the ground beneath them. They made no impression at all. He stopped a few feet from me, close enough that I could see the fine details of his face, the faint lines around his eyes, the weathered texture of skin that had spent time outdoors, but not years. not a decade. He smelled faintly of smoke and pine resin, exactly like someone who had just stepped away from a campfire. Nothing about him looked unnatural on its own. It was only the context that made him impossible. I forced myself to speak first. My voice came out unsteady, thinner than I expected. I said my name. I said I was hiking the trail and hadn't meant to intrude. I asked if everything was all right. He listened without interrupting, his head tilted slightly, as if processing words in a foreign accent. When I finished, he nodded once. Just once. Then he said his name, Daniel Reeves. Hearing it spoken aloud, matching the memory in my head, sent a cold ripple through me that had nothing to do with the air temperature. He asked what day it was. I told him the date. For a brief moment, I thought he was going to laugh. His mouth twitched, as if reacting to a joke he didn't find funny. Then his expression changed, tightening around the eyes. He looked past me toward the trail, then back again. He asked me to repeat myself. I did. Slowly. Clearly. I watched his breathing change as the words settled in. Faster. Shallower. That's not possible, he said. His voice was calm. But there was something rehearsed about it. Like he was repeating a conclusion he'd already reached and didn't like. He told me the date he thought it was, the same one written in the notebook. 10 years earlier. I didn't correct him again. I didn't need to. The silence between us did the work instead. He stepped back, finally disturbing the ground as his heel pressed into the soil. This time, it left a print, perfectly formed, fresh. He looked down at it, then back at me, and for the first time, I saw fear break through his composure. Not panic, not hysteria, just the quiet realization that something fundamental had shifted. He asked me how long I'd been hiking. I told him. He asked where I'd parked. I described the trailhead, the ranger truck, the empty lot. With each answer, his face grew more strained, like he was mentally flipping through memories and finding none of them lined up anymore. He told me he'd set up camp the previous afternoon. He'd planned to rest for the night and continue in the morning. He hadn't heard anyone else on the trail since. He hadn't noticed anything strange. No missing time, no blackouts, no gaps. To him, the world had been continuous and intact. I told him people had searched for him, that his name appeared in missing persons reports, that the trail had been rerouted years ago due to erosion further up the valley, that the version he thought he was on no longer existed in the same way. He shook his head slowly, as if trying to dislodge the words before they could settle. He asked me to prove it. I reached for my phone again, forgetting for a moment that there was no service. I showed him the date on the screen, the photos stored there. I scrolled through news articles I'd saved weeks earlier. He leaned closer, squinting, his face inches from the glass. I watched his reflection ripple faintly across the screen as his hand hovered near mine, not quite touching. When he finally pulled back, his hands were shaking. He asked me if anyone else could see him. The question caught me off guard. I told him I didn't know. I hadn't seen anyone else all day. He nodded, absorbing that with grim acceptance. He said he'd wondered sometimes, standing in that clearing, why the forest felt quieter than it should. Why animals never crossed through his camp. Why the trail ahead always seemed slightly out of focus, like a photograph taken with the wrong lens. He said he thought it was just isolation playing tricks on him. I asked him why he hadn't left. He hesitated before answering. Then he admitted that Every time he tried to pack up and move on, something stopped him. Not physically, not a barrier or a threat, just a sense that stepping beyond the clearing would be a mistake. A deep, unshakable certainty that if he crossed a certain point, he wouldn't be able to come back. He said the feeling had grown stronger over time, enough that he'd stopped trying. Listening to him, I realized something unsettling. The clearing didn't feel wrong to him. It felt safe, contained, like a room with the door closed. I asked him to walk with me, just a few steps down the trail. I told him we could go together, that whatever was happening, it didn't make sense for him to stay. He agreed, too quickly, like he was afraid to reconsider. We walked side by side toward the edge of the clearing. The moment he crossed the invisible boundary, where the ground cover changed from trampled earth to leaf litter, he gasped sharply and staggered. I grabbed his arm without thinking. My hand passed through his sleeve with only the faintest resistance, like pushing through cold water. He cried out and pulled back, clutching his arm. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me, sudden and overwhelming. The air around us seemed to thicken, pressing inward. The forest sounds cut off abruptly, replaced by a low, distant hum I felt more than heard. He told me it hurt. Not like an injury, but like pressure building behind his eyes. Like being pulled in two directions at once. He begged me to let go, even though I wasn't holding him anymore. I stepped back, hands raised, my heart racing. The moment he retreated fully into the clearing, the pressure eased. The hum faded. The birdsong returned, hesitant at first, then normal. We stood there, breathing hard, both of us shaken. He looked at me with something close to despair. He said he didn't think he could leave. Not anymore. Whatever boundary existed there had hardened over time, like scar tissue. I told him I would get help. Rangers. Authorities. Someone who could explain it, contain it, fix it. Even as I said the words, I knew how hollow they sounded. He asked me how I'd explain what I'd seen without sounding delusional. I didn't have an answer. He asked me to do one thing instead. He asked me to take his notebook. He said if he couldn't leave, then at least the record of his existence should. He wanted proof that he hadn't imagined the last 10 years, that he hadn't simply vanished without trace. He pressed the notebook into my hands. This time when our fingers touched, I felt it. Solid, real, warm. I hesitated, then nodded. I told him I'd come back. I don't know if I believed that. I don't know if he did either. As I turned to leave, I felt his gaze on my back. I didn't look again. Something told me that if I did, it would be harder to go. The trail ahead felt longer than it had before, stretching unnaturally as I walked. My watch buzzed, signaling a time change I hadn't authorized. I ignored it and kept moving. I didn't stop until the smell of smoke faded completely. I didn't realize how far I'd walked until my legs began to ache in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. It felt delayed, like my body was only now being allowed to register what had happened. The trail was familiar again. Markers where I expected them. Switchbacks matching the map I'd studied before the hike. The forest had regained its depth and texture. Layered sounds and movement returning as if someone had lifted a heavy blanket off it. When I finally reached the trailhead, the sun was already low, hanging just above the tree line. The ranger service truck was gone. My car was the only one left in the lot. I stood there for a long time without unlocking the door, half expecting to smell smoke again, or hear footsteps behind me. Nothing followed. The notebook was still in my pack. I hadn't dared to check until I was back in the car with the doors locked. My hands shook as I pulled it out and set it on the passenger seat. It looked ordinary. A cheap, weatherproof field notebook. The plastic sleeve was scuffed now, as if it had aged suddenly during the hike out. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station, without stopping. The road out of the park felt unreal, like I was watching it through someone else's eyes. When I arrived, I told them everything. Not all at once. I started with the campsite. The notebook. I left out the parts that would make them stop listening. They took the notebook seriously. More seriously than I expected. The ranger on duty recognized the name immediately. His demeanor shifted in a way that told me I wasn't the first person to bring it up, just the first in a long time. They asked me to sit down. They made copies of the pages. They asked me to retrace my steps on a map. When I pointed to the location of the clearing, there was a brief, uncomfortable silence. That area, they told me, had been closed off years ago. Not officially, not with signs or barriers. It simply wasn't part of any maintained road anymore. Erosion, unstable ground, survey inconsistencies. The explanations were vague and carefully worded. When I asked why the trail still led there, the ranger avoided my eyes and said that maps don't always update as cleanly as people think. They didn't send anyone out that night. They said it was too late, too dark, too risky. They promised a search team in the morning. I offered to guide them back myself. They declined. I left the station feeling like I'd failed something important without fully understanding what it was. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the clearing exactly as it had been, preserved in perfect detail. The fire, the tent, Daniel Reeves standing at the edge, watching me leave. At some point near dawn, my phone buzzed again. Not with a notification, but with a sudden jump in the clock. The time skipped forward by 3 minutes without explanation. The search team went out later that morning. I waited for the call. That would tell me they'd found the campsite. That there was a rational explanation. That whatever boundary existed had been crossed or dismantled. The call never came. When I followed up, I was told they'd found nothing. No clearing. No fire ring. No sign of recent human activity. The area I'd marked on the map was dense forest, undisturbed. They suggested I'd misjudged the location. Fatigue, stress, memory distortion, all the usual things. They returned the notebook to me, saying it was likely a reproduction, a hoax. Something left behind intentionally years ago. The paper tests showed age consistent with its supposed timeline. 10 years. Nothing anomalous. I stopped hiking after that. Not immediately, but gradually. Trails began to feel unreliable, like they might lead somewhere they weren't supposed to. I became acutely aware of moments when the world felt too still, too focused. I kept the notebook locked away, but I thought about it constantly. Weeks later, I noticed something new. The final entry, the one that had ended mid-sentence, was no longer unfinished. The handwriting was the same. The ink matched. The words described the clearing growing quieter, the days blending together. The sense that something was watching from beyond the trees but never approaching. Then there was a line that made my stomach drop. It mentioned a man on the trail, a hiker, a witness, someone who said it wasn't the right year. The entry was dated the same day I'd found the campsite. I checked the rest of the notebook. Other entries had shifted subtly. Details added. Small corrections. references to events Daniel couldn't have known about unless time inside the clearing was no longer isolated, unless my visit had changed something. I returned to the ranger station with the notebook again. They denied any knowledge of alterations. They suggested stress, obsession, projection. One of them quietly advised me to let it go, in a tone that carried more concern than dismissal. I tried. I really did. But once you know a place exists that doesn't obey the same rules as the rest of the world, it's hard not to think about who else might be trapped there. Or how many times the boundary has shifted without anyone noticing. The last change appeared a month later. A new entry, written in a shakier hand, thanking the reader for remembering him. It said the forest had grown louder recently, that the air felt thinner, that the boundary didn't hurt as much as it used to. The final line asked a question. It asked if anyone had come back yet. I haven't returned. I don't know if I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, when everything around me goes quiet in the wrong way, I swear I can smell smoke on the air. My name is Peter Lang. I am employed by the Regional Parks Authority as a field technician, assigned primarily to trail infrastructure, signage, markers, distance posts, and safety notices. My work is administrative by design and physical by necessity. I am not a ranger, not a search and rescue specialist, and not trained to investigate disappearances. My responsibility is limited, clearly defined, and usually uneventful. I make sure people know where they are going, and what they have been warned not to do. The assignment that led to everything I am about to describe was logged as routine maintenance. A cluster of trail signs in a forest management zone had been flagged for replacement after repeated reports of vandalism and weather damage. The area itself was not new to me. I had serviced sections of it twice before over the past 3 years. It was not classified as dangerous, restricted, or remote beyond standard backcountry parameters. It did, however, have one peculiarity noted in internal documentation: a specific warning sign, placed at a narrow junction where a secondary footpath diverged from the main loop. The wording of that sign was unusually direct. Dio noxotian u pestititis. Rameno antiti martral. It did not cite wildlife, unstable terrain, or seasonal hazards. There was no legal code attached. Just the instruction printed in bold block lettering, mounted on treated wood facing outward at chest height. Over the past 18 months, at least 9 visitors had gone missing in the general vicinity. Not all at once. Not in a pattern obvious enough to close the area. Each case was handled individually, categorized under navigation error, exposure, or presumed voluntary disappearance. Still, every internal summary mentioned the same detail. The missing individuals had last been seen, photographed, or logged near that warning sign. My task was to replace it. I arrived at the trailhead shortly after sunrise. My work order specified completion within a single day. I signed in at the ranger station, collected the replacement signage from storage, and logged my radio frequency for routine check-ins. The weather was stable, visibility good. There was no sense of urgency or unease when I started down the path. If anything, I was irritated by how much attention this particular sign had received. In my experience, hikers ignored warnings constantly. That did not mean the forest was doing something to them. The main trail was clearly marked, compacted from use, bordered by low brush and tall pines. About 2 miles in, the junction appeared exactly where my map indicated. The warning sign stood there, slightly tilted, its surface scuffed and sun-faded. Someone had tried to carve into it at some point, shallow grooves crossing the word Kenti, Inue. I photographed it for records, then unbolted it from the post. The moment I lifted it free, I noticed something odd. Behind the sign, pressed into the soil where the post had stood, were footprints. Not old impressions softened by rain, but crisp, well-defined prints. Several sets, overlapping, all facing away from the main trail and toward the narrower path beyond the warning. None facing back. I told myself this meant nothing. People stepped off trails all the time, especially near junctions. I secured the old sign in my pack and installed the replacement, making sure it was level and visible from both approaches. The new lettering was sharper, darker, impossible to miss. Before leaving, I stood there longer than necessary, looking down the unmarked path. It was narrower than the main trail, barely more than a break in the undergrowth. No signage indicated it as an official route. According to the map, it curved slightly and rejoined the loop less than a mile later. There was no logical reason it should have attracted the attention it did. I turned back toward the main trail and began walking. Less than 50 steps away, I heard movement behind me. Not footsteps exactly, more like fabric brushing against leaves. I stopped. The sound stopped with me. I waited several seconds, then continued. After another few steps, it happened again, closer this time. When I turned around, there was nothing there. The sign stood alone, the forest quiet. I finished my scheduled replacements along the loop by late morning. Each task went as expected. But I could not shake the sensation that my awareness was misaligned, as if I were slightly out of sync with the environment. Sounds arrived a fraction of a second late. My radio crackled with static during check, and though the signal indicator showed full strength. When I reported the completion of the work order, the ranger acknowledged it without comment and reminded me to return before dusk. On my way back, I passed the warning sign again. This time something had changed. Fresh dirt marked the ground in front of it. Footprints once more, clustered near the post. I counted at least 3 distinct tread patterns. All of them pointed past the sign into the narrow path. Again, none faced the main trail. I knelt to examine them more closely. The impressions were deep, as though the ground had softened, though the surrounding soil was dry and firm. One set of prints was smaller than the others, unevenly spaced, suggesting a limp or hurried movement. Another set showed a pronounced heel, the kind left by heavy boots. My radio crackled then, sharp enough to make me flinch. The voice that came through was distorted, but I recognized my own call sign, being repeated back to me, as if someone were testing the line. I responded. There was a pause, then the ranger asked if I was still near the junction. I said yes. He told me to leave the area and return to the trailhead immediately. I asked why. He did not answer directly. Instead, he asked if the sign was installed correctly. I confirmed that it was. Another pause followed, longer this time. When he spoke again, his tone was careful, controlled. Did you see anyone go past it today? I said no. That was true. Good, he replied. Then don't. The transmission ended there. I stood up, suddenly aware of how quiet everything had become. No wind in the trees. No birds. Even the distant ambient noise I had grown accustomed to was gone. I took a step back toward the main trail, then another. Behind me, from somewhere beyond the warning sign, I heard a voice. It was low, strained, and distant, as if carried through dense foliage. I could not make out words at first, only the rhythm of speech, uneven and urgent. The voice repeated something, over and over, each time a little clearer. "Hey," it called. "Hey, I can see the sign." I did not turn around. I stayed where I was longer than was reasonable. My weight balanced forward, as if my body expected to move before my mind caught up. The voice did not repeat itself immediately. That silence felt deliberate, like a pause meant to test whether I would respond. I kept my eyes fixed on the main trail, on the familiar markers and compacted soil that represented procedure, safety, and an explanation I could later put into words. I did not acknowledge the voice. I stepped away from the junction and continued toward the trailhead, forcing myself into a steady pace. After about 30 yards, the ambient sounds returned in pieces. The rustle of leaves, the faint creak of trees shifting, the distant knock of something hollow being struck by wind. None of it felt reassuring. It felt staged, like sound returning to a room after a power outage, too sudden to be natural. My radio remained silent. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sky had begun to dim. The ranger station lights were on, but the building itself was empty. A note on the counter instructed field staff to log out digitally if returning after hours. That alone was not unusual. What unsettled me was the timestamp on the system. Log. According to it, I had checked out of the field an hour earlier. I assumed it was a clerical error. I corrected the entry, noted my actual return time, and locked the door behind me. As I started my truck, the radio came alive without prompting. The same ranger's voice cut through, clearer now. "Peter," he said. "Are you at the trailhead?" I said yes. There was a brief sound on the other end. Paper shifting, maybe someone covering the receiver. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "You need to confirm something for me," he said. "Did you replace the sign exactly as specified?" I told him I had followed the work order precisely. Facing outward, he continued. "Correct height. No additional markings." Another pause. "Then whatever you heard wasn't responding to you," he said. "It was responding to the sign." I asked him to explain. He did not. Instead, he told me to stay where I was and wait for a patrol unit. He said it would take about 40 minutes. I agreed, shut off the engine, and sat in the cab with my hands on the steering wheel, watching the forest edge. 20 minutes passed without incident. Then, slowly, deliberately, the radio turned on again. This time, the voice was not the ranger's. It sounded like a man in his 30s or 40s, breathless, speaking through exertion. The signal crackled as if he were moving while talking. I reached for the handset, then stopped. The ranger's words replayed in my head. I did not respond. The voice continued anyway. "I'm not lost," it said. "I can see where I came in. I just need someone to tell me which way the loop goes." I looked out toward the trees. There was no movement, no flashlight beam. No indication anyone was near the trailhead. The voice shifted slightly in tone, frustration creeping in. I followed the sign like it said. It added. I stayed on the trail. I stayed where it told me to go. The phrasing was wrong. Subtly, but unmistakably. The sign did not tell anyone to go anywhere. It told them where not to go. The radio clicked off. When the patrol truck arrived, there were 2 rangers inside. Neither asked me to recount what I had heard. They checked my paperwork, confirmed the sign replacement, and instructed me to go home. One of them, an older man with a weathered face, lingered as I gathered my things. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. "You did exactly what you were supposed to." I asked him how many people had gone missing near that junction. He did not give me a number. Instead, he said, "Enough that we stopped calling it coincidence." I drove home in the dark, the events of the day replaying in fragments. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw footprints facing the wrong direction. I did not sleep. Sometime after midnight, my phone buzzed with a notification. An internal bulletin had been issued to all field staff. A hiker had been reported overdue. Last known location the same trail loop. The timestamp placed them there after I had left. Attached to the bulletin was a photograph. It showed the new warning sign, clean and intact, taken from the main trail side. In the background, just beyond the post, someone stood partially obscured by trees. Only their upper body was visible. They were facing the sign, head tilted slightly, as if reading. I enlarged the image. The person's mouth was open. I recognized the jacket. It was one of the standard issue windbreakers issued to seasonal staff. The same model I had been wearing earlier that day. I checked my closet to be sure mine was still there. It was. The next morning, I received a call instructing me to return to the site immediately. The sign had been found removed. Not damaged, not stolen. Carefully unbolted and laid flat beside the post, as if set aside. I arrived just after dawn. The junction looked wrong without it. Exposed. The ground was churned with footprints. Dozens of them now, circling the empty post. All of them faced inward, toward the space where the sign had stood. I found the sign lying face down in the dirt. When I turned it over, my breath caught. The lettering had been altered. The original warning was still visible beneath a new layer of paint, darker and uneven, applied by hand. "Wow, you can continue no W." I did not touch it again. Behind me, from somewhere along the unmarked path, I heard footsteps approaching. Slow. Unhurried. Accompanied by a familiar voice, testing the air. "Hey," it called. "I can see the sign." I did not turn around. I knew, with a certainty that bypassed reason, that if I did, the day would end differently. I kept my eyes on the altered sign, on the crude brushstrokes still wet enough to glisten. The words did not look threatening. That was what made them unbearable. They were permissive. They offered relief. They offered permission. The footsteps stopped several yards behind me. I could feel the presence there. Close enough that the quiet pressed in around it. The voice spoke again, nearer now, and this time it sounded exactly like mine. "You finished the update," it said. "You did your job. That's what matters." I forced myself to breathe evenly. I told myself this was stress, auditory distortion, suggestion layered onto fatigue. I told myself there were explanations that did not require me to look back. A radio crackled to life at my belt. The sound was abrupt, loud enough to fracture the moment. I answered immediately. "Peter," the older ranger said. "Stay where you are. Do not acknowledge anything you hear." "We are close." I said nothing else. I did not move. The presence behind me shifted. Leaves compressed under careful weight. The voice dropped its mimicry, the cadence slipping, like a mask settling poorly. "They keep leaving it up," it said. "They keep telling people no. That's not fair." My hands trembled at my sides. I stared at the sign and understood, then, what had been happening all along. The warning was not there to keep people safe. It was there to deny something access, to withhold consent, to say no on behalf of those who might be persuaded otherwise. The thing behind me took a step closer. "I followed the rules," it said. "I stayed on the trail." "You didn't," I said, before I could stop myself. The word felt like a breach. The forest reacted to it. Sound drained away again, leaving only my breathing and the soft scrape of movement behind me. The voice did not respond immediately. When it did, it was quieter. "They changed," it said. "After the sign, I understood that too. The sign had not always been there. Someone had put it up because something had already gone wrong. The disappearances were not the cause. They were the consequence." The radio crackled again. Closer now, louder. I heard the patrol truck before I saw it, the engine noise cutting through the stillness. The presence behind me recoiled, not retreating so much as folding inward, like something withdrawing behind a thin barrier. "You can continue now," it said, almost pleading. I shook my head. I did not look back. The Rangers emerged from the trees moments later, moving quickly, deliberately. One of them grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the junction without asking permission. The older ranger approached the sign, studied it briefly, then flipped it face down again. "No one reads it," he said. "That's the problem." They did not ask me to explain what I had heard. They did not ask me to describe the voice. They escorted me back to the main trail and told me to wait by the patrol truck. As they worked, I watched the junction from a distance. Without the sign standing, it looked like nothing. Just another narrow break in the woods. They reinstalled the original warning sign, not the new one, not the altered one. The weathered, faded version, scars and all. When it was back in place, the forest felt different. Heavier. Contained. Before leaving, the older ranger approached me again. "This is the last time we send anyone out here alone," he said. "And it's the last time we replace that sign." I asked him why they didn't just remove it permanently. He met my eyes. "Because then it wouldn't have to ask." By noon, the area was closed. Barriers were placed at the trailhead. Official notices cited maintenance and erosion. By late afternoon, a search operation had been quietly initiated for the overdue hiker from the bulletin. I was instructed to go home and remain available by phone. At 4:17 p.m., the search was suspended. No body was found. No belongings. Just a set of footprints near the junction, facing the warning sign. Close enough that the toes nearly touched the post. The impressions were shallow, as if the person had stood there for a long time without shifting their weight. At 6:02 p.m., I received a final call. The ranger thanked me for my cooperation and told me my assignment records would be amended. The signage update would be marked complete and closed. I was advised to take the next day off. When I asked if the sign would be checked again, he said no. "It's accurate now," he said. I returned my equipment that evening. My jacket was logged back into inventory. My radio was wiped and reset. No one mentioned the photograph from the bulletin. When I asked about it, I was told it had been corrupted and removed from the system. I went home before dark. That night I dreamed of the junction, of standing there with the sign between me and something patient, something waiting for permission it did not understand it lacked. In the dream, the wording kept changing, each version softer than the last. I woke just before midnight to the sound of my phone vibrating. There was one new message. No sender ID. No number. It was a photograph. The warning sign stood in place, illuminated by a flashlight beam. The words were intact. Untouched. In the foreground, just visible at the bottom edge of a frame, were the tips of someone's boots, facing the sign. I have not returned to trail work since that day. My reassignment paperwork cites operational restructuring. I am not listed as eligible for field maintenance. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine the sign still standing there, doing the only thing it can do. Saying no, holding the line, keeping something from being acknowledged. Because once you read the other message, once you accept it, the trail doesn't lead back. My name is Marcus Hill. At the time of the incident, I was employed as a contracted wildlife surveyor, specializing in population tracking and habitat impact assessments in protected wilderness zones. My work required extended periods alone in terrain that most people never see. Areas inaccessible by established trails, regions mapped only by satellite overlays and old forestry data. I am trained in navigation, rope access, and emergency field procedures. I state this plainly because what I encountered that day cannot be dismissed as inexperience, panic, or imagination. The entire sequence of events occurred over the course of a single workday. I began before sunrise, following a survey assignment that, on paper, was routine. I was tasked with documenting signs of alpine, ungulate migration along a high elevation ridgeline where previous drone imagery suggested unusual movement patterns. The area sat beyond the reach of maintained trails, bordered by near vertical slopes and dense subalpine forest. Access required a 6-mile approach hike, followed by a controlled ascent using fixed anchors I had placed during a prior survey months earlier. I reached the ridge shortly after 7:30 a.m. The weather was clear, the kind of crisp morning where sound travels too far and everything feels exposed. I logged coordinates, began photographing track depressions in the thin soil, and recorded vegetation damage consistent with large mammals moving in single file. Nothing was out of place. My radio check-in went through as scheduled. I remember thinking, briefly, that this would be one of the easier days. At 8:12 a.m., while following a faint game path that skirted the edge of the ridge, I noticed something pale against the darker rock below. At first glance, I assumed it was exposed limestone or a weathered tree trunk lodged in a crevice. The angle was wrong for either, but visual misinterpretation is common in steep terrain. I adjusted my position, leaned forward carefully, and raised my binoculars. What I saw was bone. Not scattered fragments, not animal remains. It was a partial human skeleton, wedged into a narrow fissure halfway down a sheer rock face. The skull was intact, angled upward, jaw slightly open. The rest of the body was incomplete, ribs exposed, one femur visible, the other missing. There were no clothes tangled nearby, no backpack, no visible gear. Just bone, clean in a way that did not match natural exposure timelines. I checked my GPS immediately. The location was more than 300 vertical feet below the ridgeline, in a section of cliff with no natural ledges, no climbing routes, and no overhead access points. To reach that crevice from above would require controlled descent with professional equipment. From below, ascent would be impossible without technical climbing. There were no anchor scars, no rope marks, no evidence of human traversal. I documented everything. Photos, coordinates, timestamps. I marked the site as a probable forensic discovery and prepared to notify authorities once I returned to radio range with sufficient signal. I did not descend. Protocol is clear about scene disturbance. I stepped back, took a breath, and reminded myself that hikers do die in remote areas, even in strange ways. I continued the survey. That decision is something I revisit often. At 9:40 a.m., less than a mile from the first site, I found the second set of remains. This time they were not skeletal. The body was partially preserved, slumped against the base of a wind, stunted pine growing out of bare rock. The location was even more inaccessible than the first. An isolated outcrop separated from the main ridge by a deep ravine choked with fallen timber. There was no path, no sign of recent animal activity. The body appeared to have been placed there deliberately, positioned upright, legs bent at an unnatural angle. The face was intact enough for me to recognize that this had been a person who died recently, within weeks at most. The skin showed no extensive scavenger damage. No clothing was present aside from a single hiking boot, still laced, still clean. The other foot was bare. There were no tracks leading to or away from the site. The soil around the tree was undisturbed. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the wind move through branches that were too thin to offer concealment. I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with elevation. I checked behind me more than once, not because I heard something, but because the absence of sound felt deliberate. By 10:30 a.m., my survey work was no longer my priority. I altered my route to move toward lower elevation, intending to reach a known radio relay point and report both discoveries. As I descended, I became acutely aware of how often I was finding myself on terrain that mirrored the locations of the bodies. Steep, isolated, unreachable except by deliberate effort. At 11:15 a.m., I found the third. This one was nothing more than scattered remains of spine, several ribs, fragments of a pelvis. They were laid out along a narrow shelf, barely wide enough for me to stand on, overlooking a drop that vanished into forest canopy. The bones were arranged in a rough line, parallel to the edge, as if aligned intentionally. There was no skull. I did not document this site for long. My hands were shaking badly enough that I struggled to steady my camera. I remember noticing that my GPS track showed no deviations, no looping, no unexplained movement. According to the data, I had followed a logical, efficient path. Yet each discovery felt less accidental, less like I was stumbling onto something, and more like I was being guided through a sequence. At noon, I stopped to eat, though I had no appetite. I sat on a fallen log, back against a boulder, eyes scanning constantly. I kept replaying the logistics in my head. Multiple bodies, multiple locations, all unreachable, all discovered within a few hours of each other. This was not the result of a single accident or even a single event. This was a pattern. At 12:47 p.m., I smelled decay again. This time the source was above me. I looked up to see a body suspended between two trees on a narrow saddle ridge, positioned in a way that defied gravity. The torso was caught between branches too thin to support that weight. There were no ropes, no fabric, no visible means of suspension. The legs hung freely, toes pointed downward, swaying slightly in the breeze. I did not approach. I backed away slowly, heart hammering. My thoughts collapsing into a single realization that made my stomach turn cold. Every body I had found that day occupied a place where a person should not be able to be, and I was moving through those same places with increasing ease. At 1:30 p.m., my radio crackled to life without prompting. No call sign, no static, just a brief, open-channel tone followed by nothing. I attempted to respond. There was no reply. By mid-afternoon, I stopped trying to rationalize what I was seeing. I focused instead on leaving the area alive. I altered my descent again. aiming for a service road several miles east. That was when I noticed something I had somehow missed until then. There were no animal tracks anywhere near the remains. No scavenger sign. No drag marks. No feeding disturbance. Whatever had placed those bodies had done so without interference from wildlife, in an environment where animals should have found them quickly. At 3:10 p.m., I found the last site. It was empty. The location matched another GPS anomaly I had logged automatically earlier in the day. A brief pause in my movement that I could not remember making. The ground was bare rock. No bones. No body. Just a shallow depression shaped like a human form, pressed into lichen and soil as if something had lain there recently and then been lifted straight up. I stood there until my legs ached, staring at that outline, understanding with quiet certainty that if I had arrived even a little earlier, or stayed in one place a little longer, I might have completed the pattern myself. I left the area by nightfall. Authorities later recovered several of the remains I reported. Others were never found again. No missing persons cases officially matched the locations. The terrain was declared too dangerous for further recovery attempts. I no longer conduct field surveys alone, and I no longer dismiss places that should be impossible to reach, because I know now that something out there understands access in a way we do not. I reached the service road just after sunset, exhausted in a way that went deeper than muscle fatigue. My legs moved automatically, my breathing shallow and controlled, the way it gets when adrenaline has been stretched thin for too long. I remember stepping onto gravel and feeling relief that surprised me with its intensity. Solid ground. Human infrastructure. Proof that the day was almost over. That relief did not last. The radio finally caught a stable signal at 6:41 p.m. I reported everything. Coordinates, number of sites, condition of remains, the impossible access points. I kept my voice even, professional, aware that panic would only slow the response. The dispatcher asked me to repeat myself more than once. There was a pause after I finished, long enough that I thought the signal had dropped again. Then she asked me a question I wasn't prepared for. She asked why my GPS track showed me stopping a location that didn't exist on any of their maps. I asked her to repeat that. She gave me a set of coordinates and a timestamp, 2:58 p.m. According to my unit, I had remained stationary there for nearly 11 minutes. I told her that wasn't possible. I had no memory of stopping that long, and certainly not in unfamiliar terrain. She suggested equipment error, but her tone had shifted. She asked if I had noticed anything unusual during that period. I didn't answer right away. I pulled the GPS unit from my pack and scrolled through the log. The data was clean. No signal loss, no drift, a clear, unmoving point in the middle of dense elevation contour lines. A place I could not picture, but that my body reacted to immediately with a tightness in my chest. I told her I didn't remember stopping there. She told me to remain where I was and wait for instructions. While I waited, I noticed something else. The service road was quiet in a way that felt wrong. No wind, no insects. Even the distant forest noise had faded into a flat, empty silence. The sun dipped behind the ridge, shadows stretching across the road like something physical. I stood there longer than necessary, eyes fixed on the tree line, half expecting movement. At 7:19 p.m., headlights appeared around the bend. A park response vehicle pulled up, followed by a second truck carrying a small recovery team. The moment I saw other people, the tension in my shoulders loosened just enough for the weight of the day to settle in fully. I handed over my equipment, answered questions, walked them through what I had found. They listened, they believed me. At least, they believed the facts. But when we reviewed the GPS data together, something changed. One of the technicians pointed out that the unexplained stop at 2058 p.m. overlapped almost perfectly with the location of the empty impression I had described. The human-shaped depression with no remains. The coordinates matched within a few feet. I felt a chill run through me as the implication took shape. I had been there. I just didn't remember it. They escorted me back to the field office that night for a formal statement. The building felt too small after spending the day in open wilderness, the walls pressing in with fluorescent brightness and the smell of stale coffee. I sat across from an investigator and repeated the story again, this time slower, more carefully. When I finished, he asked me something I hadn't considered. He asked if I had noticed any signs of human activity near the remains. Not tracks or gear, signs of pause. Places where someone might have stood, knelt, or waited. I thought back through the day, replaying images that had already begun to blur at the edges. The upright body at the pine. The aligned bones on the ledge. The suspended corpse between trees. All of them had been positioned in ways that suggested intention, not randomness. Deliberate placement. Deliberate viewing angles. I realized then that every site had something in common I hadn't articulated. They were all visible from somewhere else. Each body could be seen clearly from a nearby vantage point. A ridge, a shelf, a saddle. Places where someone could stand safely and observe without being seen. Places that matched the way I had moved through the terrain that day. The investigator wrote that down without comment. I was released just after midnight with instructions not to discuss the incident outside official channels. I drove home in silence, every shadow along the road feeling heavier than it should have. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that empty impression in the ground, waiting. The next morning, I returned to the office to retrieve personal items from my pack. The GPS unit was still there, tagged for analysis. I asked if I could review the full data log one more time. The technician hesitated, then agreed. There was something new. Between 2:58 p.m. and 3:09 p.m. The unit had recorded slight orientation changes, small shifts in bearing that suggested movement, but not displacement, as if I had been turning in place. Slowly, repeatedly. The pattern resembled someone scanning an area. I asked if there was any chance the unit could have been moved without my knowledge. He said no. The strap sensors would have registered removal. The data indicated that it had remained attached to me the entire time. I left the building feeling unsteady, my confidence in my own perception eroding. That afternoon, authorities attempted to revisit several of the recovery sites with a larger team. I followed the updates from a distance, trying to stay detached. They found nothing. The crevice with the skeleton was empty. The bones were gone without disturbance to the surrounding rock. The pine tree outcrop showed no sign that a body had ever been there. Even the lichen impression had faded, the ground springing back as if nothing had pressed into it. The official explanation cited animal activity, environmental factors, and the inherent instability of high elevation terrain. I listened to those words and understood why they were being used. I also knew they didn't account for what I had seen. That night, I noticed dirt under my fingernails that hadn't been there before. I scrubbed my hands until the skin reddened, but the memory stuck with me. The texture. The smell of soil that matched the elevation, where the empty impression had been found. I tried to tell myself it was residue from the day's work. It didn't feel convincing. Sleep came in fragments. I dreamed of standing on narrow ledges, looking down at myself from impossible angles. In the dreams, I was both observer and observers, arriving too late to stop something that had already been decided. In the days that followed, more details emerged. Several missing persons reports from different years, loosely aligned with the area I had surveyed. None had been officially connected before. None had recovered remains. All involved experienced hikers or climbers who should not have vanished without trace. I was asked to walk investigators through my road again, using maps and imagery. As we traced the path, one of them remarked on how efficient it was, how naturally it moved through difficult terrain, avoiding hazards without obvious planning. He said it was as if I already knew where to step. I didn't tell him that was exactly how it had felt. What unsettles me most now isn't the bodies, or even the missing time. It's the growing certainty that whatever placed those remains wasn't hiding them. It was documenting something. And on that day, moving through terrain no one should be able to reach so easily, I may have been part of the record. The last thing I expected was to be asked to return to the field. 3 days after the incident, just before dusk, I received a call from the regional coordinator. His voice was careful, neutral in the way people get when they are choosing words around something fragile. He told me they needed clarification on several data points. He said no recovery operation was planned. He said it would be brief. He said I would not be alone. I agreed before I fully understood why. We met at a temporary staging area near the service road, the same stretch of gravel where I had felt relief that first night. This time there were 4 of us: myself, an investigator, a terrain specialist, and a ranger whose job was strictly to observe and document. The plan was simple. We would follow my recorded GPS track from that day as closely as possible until nightfall, then exit together. No deviation, no solo movement. The forest looked unchanged, but it felt different. Not hostile, not threatening, just aware. As we moved uphill, I noticed how easily my body remembered the route. My feet placed themselves with confidence that startled me. I stepped over loose stone before anyone warned me. I chose handholds without hesitation. The terrain specialist commented on it once, lightly, with professional admiration. I did not return the smile. By the time we reached the area near the first discovery site, the light had begun to thin. The crevice where the skeleton had been was empty, just as the reports said. I stood at the edge and felt the same tightening in my chest as before, the sensation of standing somewhere I had stood already, even if I couldn't remember when. The investigator asked me to describe exactly what I had seen that morning. As I spoke, something subtle happened. The words came easily, but the images felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. I could describe angles, positions, conditions, but not the feeling. That part of it was gone, stripped away cleanly. At 2:47 p.m. by the old log, according to my GPS, we reached the coordinates of the unexplained stop. No one spoke. The place looked unremarkable. A narrow shelf of rock, a drop off to one side, dense trees on the other. No impression, no disturbance. Just another dangerous place that no one would linger without reason. The ranger broke the silence first. He said the air felt heavier there. I hadn't noticed until he said it, but once he did, it became impossible to ignore. Sound dulled. Our footsteps lost their sharpness. Even the wind seemed to avoid the space. The investigator checked his watch. The terrain specialist adjusted his PAP straps twice, restless. I felt something else. Recognition. I knew exactly where to stand. Without thinking, I stepped forward, placing my boot on a flat stone near the center of the shelf. The moment my weight settled, my GPS unit vibrated softly. Not an alert, not an error, just a confirmation tone. The investigator asked me what I was doing. I told him the truth. I said I thought this was where I had stopped before. The ranger's radio crackled, then went dead. No one moved for several seconds. Then the terrain specialist said quietly that his depth perception felt off, like the edge was closer than it looked. He took a step back. The investigator followed. The ranger stayed where he was, eyes fixed on me. I realized then that I was the only one not feeling uneasy. In fact, I felt calm. I turned slowly, the way the GPS data had shown, scanning the surrounding terrain. From that position, everything made sense. Sightlines opened up. I could see the saddle ridge where the suspended body had been. I could see the outcrop with the pine. I could see the ledge where the bones had been aligned. It was all visible from there. The investigator told me to step away. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I couldn't hear him, but because the idea felt wrong, like interrupting something mid-measurement. I noticed then that my breathing had synced with something else. Not a sound, but a rhythm in the environment itself, subtle and steady. The ranger grabbed my arm. The contact snapped whatever thread had been pulling my attention outward. The calm vanished, replaced by a rush of cold clarity, so sharp it made me gasp. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing before the terrain specialist caught me. The moment my boot left that stone, the heaviness lifted. We did not stay longer than necessary. No one suggested continuing. We descended in tight formation, radios checked repeatedly. Flashlights on even before full dark. No one spoke about what had happened, but the silence between us was strained brittle. At the service road, the investigator thanked me for my cooperation and told me that would be the end of my involvement. He said it firmly, as if saying it made it true. I went home and packed my field gear that same night. 2 weeks later, I received a final report summary. The language was clinical, cautious. No definitive conclusions. No acknowledgement of anomalies beyond equipment discrepancies and environmental stress. My unexplained stop was attributed to fatigue and momentary disorientation. The document ended with a recommendation that I not be assigned to solo fieldwork in high-risk terrain. I accepted that without argument. Since then, I've reviewed my data countless times. I know every timestamp by memory. I know where the gaps are. What I cannot explain is why my GPS unit continues to record brief orientation changes at night, even when it's powered off and stored in a drawer. Always slight, always in place, as if something is still checking its angles. I don't return to those mountains anymore. I avoid even looking at satellite images of the region. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel that shelf beneath my boots. I can still sense the way the terrain opens up when you stand in exactly the right place. Whatever put those bodies where no one should be able to reach wasn't acting randomly. It wasn't hunting. It wasn't hiding evidence. It was establishing viewpoints. And on that single day, moving through impossible ground with borrowed certainty, I wasn't just a witness. I was briefly positioned exactly where something else wanted me to stand. My name is Andrew Foster. I am a senior archival analyst contracted by the Regional Park Service, assigned to review, digitize, and cross-reference historical ranger logs that span nearly 8 decades. My work is not fieldwork. I do not patrol trails or respond to calls. I sit in climate-controlled rooms, surrounded by shelves of binders, handwritten notebooks, carbon-copied reports, and reel-to-reel transcriptions that most people will never read. My task is simple: find inconsistencies, missing entries, and procedural failures that might explain unresolved incidents. Until this morning, I believed that was all there was to it. I arrived at the Ranger headquarters at 7:12 a.m., earlier than usual. The building sits in a shallow valley, far enough from the tree line to avoid falling debris, close enough that the forest always feels present. I remember noticing the fog on the drive-in. It was thick, low, and moving faster than I expected, spilling across the road in smooth sheets. Fog is common here, but not this early, not this dense, and not in late summer. I noted it the way I always note environmental anomalies, without emotion, just as data. Inside, the archive room smelled faintly of paper and ozone from the dehumidifiers. I logged in, signed the physical ledger, and began working through a series of ranger station incident logs from the late 1980s. These were routine at-first wildlife sightings, trail maintenance notes, weather observations, radio checks. Missing persons reports appear often in these records, but usually with clear context: storms, injuries, exposure. That morning, I was not looking for disappearances. I was looking for transcription gaps. The pattern found me anyway. It started with a date: August 14, 1987. A single line entry marked "Failure to locate subject, search suspended at 2300 hours." No follow-up, no recovery report. That in itself is unusual. I checked the weather log for that day. Clear skies until late evening. Then I noticed the margin note, written smaller than the rest. Fog came in early. I moved on. Another report, different year. Same phrasing. Another margin note. Another early fog reference. I told myself this was coincidence, confirmation bias forming too quickly, so I stopped looking for disappearances and instead created a simple spreadsheet: date, time, weather, outcome. By 9:40 a.m., I had 13 entries. All 13 involved missing persons. All 13 occurred on different trails, different seasons, different decades. And all 13 shared one detail: fog, rolling in hours earlier than forecasted. No storms, no equipment failures, no signs of struggle. In several cases, rangers documented that the missing individuals were experienced hikers or staff. One was a seasonal ranger. Another was a surveyor. None were found. At 10:18 a.m., the fog outside the archive windows thickened enough that the tree line disappeared entirely. I remember standing up to look, holding my coffee mid-air, feeling an unexpected tightening in my chest. Visibility dropped to almost nothing in less than 5 minutes. Radios crackled in the distance as day staff began checking in. I returned to the logs with a sense of urgency I hadn't felt before. One entry stopped me completely. It was dated September 3, 1994. The reporting ranger described responding to a routine check in failure. The subject was last heard over radio at 16:47 hours. Reporting: fog rolling fast from the west. Search efforts began immediately. At 18:10 hours, visibility dropped to near zero across the sector. At 19:02 hours, the ranger in charge wrote a line I had never seen before in any official document. Fog does not behave normally here. It moves like it is aware of us. I reread that sentence several times. It wasn't crossed out. It wasn't corrected. It remained in the final report. The next line was time-stamped exactly 1 minute later. Subject not responding. Sound carried oddly. Could not determine direction. There was no recovery report attached. At 11:06 a.m., the building's automated weather alert chimed. Early fog advisory. Issued less than 5 minutes prior. That should not have been possible. Forecasts are issued hours in advance. I checked the live feed from the road camera. The fog was no longer drifting. It was pooling. Thick, unmoving. Pressed against the asphalt like a physical barrier. I told myself to stop. Archive work can play tricks on the mind. Patterns emerge because we look for them. That is what training teaches you. So I did the responsible thing. I pulled the oldest log set available, dating back to the 1940s, before standardized reporting formats. The handwriting was careful, formal. Rangers then wrote like clerks, not like field officers. Yet even there, the pattern held. Fog arrived before dusk. Visibility lost prematurely. Sound suppressed. Search abandoned due to disorientation. One entry, dated October 22, 1951, ended with a sentence that made my hands go cold. Fog came early, so did the silence. At noon, the power flickered once. Just enough to reset the clock on the wall. When it came back, the time read 1200 exactly. No minutes lost. No explanation given. I checked my phone. No signal. Outside, the fog pressed against the building, swallowing sound. The usual midday activity. Vehicles, voices, radios had gone quiet. Not abruptly. Gradually, like something turning down a dial. I became aware then that I had been hearing something faint for several minutes. Not a sound exactly. More like an absence where sound should be. The hum of the lights felt too loud. My breathing felt intrusive. I opened one last log. It was not cataloged properly, tucked between two unrelated years. No date on the cover. Inside, the writing was modern. My name is Andrew Foster. It began. I stared at the page, certain it had to be a coincidence. But the handwriting was wrong for that era. The ink was fresh. The next line was worse. Fog arrived early today. I think it always does. I closed the binder slowly, my pulse loud in my ears. The fog outside touched the windows now, sliding across the glass in smooth, deliberate waves. The radio on the wall crackled once, then went dead. I checked the time again. Still noon. That is where this account must pause, because everything after that becomes harder to explain. And harder to accept as something that happened in a single day. But it did. I did not open the binder again. I pushed it away as if the paper itself carried heat. Training tells you to document anomalies, not react to them. But there is a threshold where procedure gives way to instinct. That page had crossed it. I stood there longer than I realized, listening to the building breathe. Metal ticking, vents whispering. Sounds that felt suddenly exposed, as though the fog outside could hear them too. The radio remained silent. I toggled the power switch off and on. No static, no carrier tone. That, more than the writing, unsettled me. Even during outages, there is always something. I checked the landline next. Dead. Not busy, not disconnected. Just dead. At 20:07 p.m., I attempted to leave. The front door opened normally. But the moment I stepped onto the concrete walkway, the fog erased depth entirely. The parking lot vanished after a few feet. Sound behaved strangely. My footstep echoed back to me, delayed, softened, like it had traveled farther than it should have. I took 2 more steps and stopped. The fog was not drifting past me. It was sliding sideways, slow and level, like a curtain being drawn. I called out. My own voice came back wrong, flattened, stripped of direction. I could not tell if it had echoed or simply been absorbed. I went back inside and locked the door. I told myself to wait it out. Fog burns off. It always does. So I returned to the archive room, sat down, and forced myself to work. Not on the binder, on anything else. I opened a random box and pulled a maintenance log from the early 2000s. The first few pages were ordinary. Generator checks, fence repairs, weather notes. Then I noticed something off about the timestamps. Entries jumped forward, then backward, then forward again, all within the same day. I checked the date. It matched today's date. Month and day identical. Different year. At 12:23 p.m., the lights dimmed again, not enough to go out, just enough to feel intentional. I became aware that the fog had reached the interior windows now. The narrow panes that looked into the hallway. It slid past them slowly, thick enough to blur the fluorescent fixtures beyond into pale halos. That was when I heard footsteps. They did not echo. They did not scrape. They sounded close, soft, careful, as if whoever was walking did not want to be heard. I stood, heart hammering, and called out again, louder this time. No response. The footsteps stopped. I moved to the doorway and looked down the hall. Fog had crept inside. Not billowing. Not rushing. Just present, pooling at ankle height, unmoving. It should not have been possible. The building is sealed. Climate controlled. I knew every vent and gap. I backed into the archive room and shut the door. At 12:41 p.m., my phone vibrated once. No signal appeared. No notification. Just the vibration. I checked the time. Still noon on the wall clock. My watch read 12:41. The 2 devices no longer agreed. I returned to the spreadsheet. I needed something concrete. Something measurable. I expanded the criteria. Time of fog onset. Duration. Last known position of missing subjects. I plotted them roughly on a map. They formed no pattern geographically. But temporally, something emerged. Every disappearance occurred within a narrow window after early fog arrival. Not during. After. As if something waited for the fog to settle before moving. At 1:02 p.m., the building's motion sensor alarm chirped once, and then reset. No alert followed. The control panel showed nothing. I was alone, according to the system. I heard breathing. It was not loud. It was not close enough to be immediately threatening. It came from somewhere deeper in the building, slow and measured, like someone pacing themselves. I counted the intervals. Inhale, exhale, 2 regular, 2 controlled. I forced myself to move. Remaining still felt dangerous. I took the emergency flashlight from the wall and stepped into the hallway. The beam cut through the fog in a narrow cone. It illuminated nothing beyond a few feet, the light dissolving into gray. The breathing stopped when the light came on. I advanced slowly, keeping one hand against the wall. Doors loomed out of the fog and vanished again as I passed them. When I reached the main operations room, I froze. The front door stood open. Fog poured through it now, thicker than before, spilling across the floor like liquid. And standing just beyond the threshold, no more than a silhouette, was a figure. It did not move. It did not advance. It simply stood there, partially obscured, its outline wavering as the fog passed through it. I could not see features. I could not even be certain it was human, except that it stood upright. I raised the flashlight. The beam struck the fog and bent slightly, warping around the silhouette rather than illuminating it fully. The light did not behave correctly. The figure took one step back, not away from me, deeper into the fog. I slammed the door shut and locked it, hands shaking so badly I dropped the flashlight. When I picked it up, the beam flickered but held. At 1:27 p.m. the radio crackled to life. "Foster," a voice said, distorted and distant. "Andrew Foster." Respond. Relief hit me so hard my knees nearly buckled. I grabbed the handset and answered immediately. "This is Foster," I said. "I'm inside the headquarters. Fog breach, I need assistance." Silence followed, then the same voice, slower. "Fog arrived early," it said. "You should not be outside." "I'm not," I replied. "Who is this?" The radio clicked once. "You already logged this," the voice said. "Check the archive." The line went dead. I stood there staring at the radio. My reflection faint in the dark glass, fog curling behind me like something alive. I did not want to return to the archive room, but I knew I had to. The binder was open when I got there. I had left it closed. A new page had been added. The handwriting was mine. "I am still inside," it read. "It is afternoon now. Fog is everywhere." I checked my watch. 1:46 p.m. I checked the wall clock. 1200. And outside the window, the fog thickened further, pressing closer, patient, as if it knew exactly how much time I had left. I did not recognize the handwriting as mine at first. That realization came later, slowly, the way cold seeps through layers of clothing, rather than striking all at once. At that moment, all I could see was that the words described my present tense too accurately to dismiss. The phrasing was clinical, restrained, the same tone I used in every professional report I had ever written. No panic, no speculation, just observation. I tore the page out of the binder. The paper felt warm, not metaphorically, physically warm, like it had been sitting under a lamp. I dropped it onto the table and backed away, breathing shallowly. The fog outside the archive window shifted in response, sliding upward, pressing higher against the glass until the light from outside dimmed another degree. I forced myself to document everything. That instinct remained intact. If this was happening, then it needed a record that did not depend on memory. I opened a fresh incident report form and began writing by hand, noting times from my watch only. The wall clock was no longer trustworthy. 1:52 p.m. Fog present inside secured facility. Unknown point of entry, no alarms triggered. Radio contact unreliable. My pen hesitated, then continued. Possible hallucination ruled out pending further evidence. That line felt dishonest the moment I wrote it. At 2:03 p.m., the breathing returned. This time it was closer. I could tell because the sound carried weight now. A faint vibration I felt through the soles of my shoes. I shut off the lights in the archive room. Darkness made the fog harder to see, but easier to track by sound. It moved differently than air should, brushing softly against metal shelving, whispering where it touched paper. Something moved in the hallway, not walking, sliding. I remained still, counting breaths, resisting the urge to run. Running inside a fog-filled building would only lead to panic and injury. I had trained myself for emergencies. This was simply another one. That was the lie I repeated until it almost worked. The sound stopped directly outside the archive door. There was a pause long enough for me to imagine a hand reaching for the handle. Instead, the door creaked slightly inward, not opening, just flexing as pressure was applied from the other side. The fog pushed through the seam like smoke, thin at first, then thicker, curling along the floor toward me. I stepped back until my shoulders touched the shelving. A voice spoke from the hallway. It used my voice. "Andrew," it said quietly. "You missed something." My mouth went dry. I did not respond. The voice did not sound distorted or unnatural. That was the worst part. It sounded tired, professional, familiar. "The pattern isn't spatial," it continued. "It's procedural." The fog at my feet shifted again, gathering, as if reacting to the sound. "What procedure?" I asked, hating that I had spoken. "The logging," the voice replied. "The act of recording. That's when it happens." I realized then that every disappearance I had cataloged ended with an unfinished record. A log cut short. A report abandoned mid-sentence. The fog did not take people wandering aimlessly. It took them while they were documenting. "Stop writing," the voice said gently. "That's how you leave." I looked down at the incident form still clutched in my hand. At 2:17 p.m. The wall clock ticked once. The sound echoed unnaturally loud. The fog recoiled slightly, pulling back toward the doorway. The pressure against the door eased. I understood then that time itself was part of whatever boundary I was dealing with. Noon was not just frozen. It was anchored. I stepped forward, heart pounding, and did something that felt profoundly wrong. I wrote faster. I documented everything in a rush, my handwriting deteriorating as my pulse spiked. The fog surged in response, thickening, crawling higher up my legs, cold now, dampening the fabric of my pants. The voice returned sharper. "Stop," it said. "You're anchoring yourself." I kept writing. 2:21 p.m. Fog reacts to documentation activity, appears responsive, mimics voice, attempts persuasion. The fog surged again, reaching my waist. The air felt heavy, difficult to inhale. The voice raised its volume, no longer calm. "You don't disappear," it said. "You replace." The realization struck with sudden clarity. The archived logs were not records of disappearances. They were substitutions. Each time someone vanished, someone else took their place in the record. The fog did not remove people from the system. It kept the system complete. I was not being hunted. I was being processed. At 2:29 p.m., the fog reached my chest. My vision narrowed. The edges of the room blurred. I dropped the pen and grabbed the binder, the one with my name in it, and hurled it across the room. It hit the wall and burst open. Pages scattered, fluttering as they hit the fog, and then stopped mid-air, suspended unnaturally before settling flat on the floor. The fog recoiled violently, pulling back toward the hallway, thinning as if wounded. I ran. I did not think. I did not plan. I ran straight for the front door, slipping once on the damp floor, slamming my shoulder into the wall, barely feeling it. I hit the door hard enough that it swung open immediately. The fog outside was thinner now. Still dense, but moving, flowing away from the building rather than toward it. I ran into it blindly, coughing, lungs burning, expecting at any moment to feel something grab me. Nothing did. I kept running until my legs gave out. When I finally looked back, the Ranger headquarters stood clear behind me, sunlight breaking through above it. The fog line stopped several yards from the entrance, sharp and defined, like a border. My watch read 3:11 p.m. I checked my phone. Signal returned all at once. Messages flooded in, missed calls, weather alerts. The fog advisory had been issued at 11:58 a.m., lifted at 3:00 p.m. I was found sitting on the gravel road by another ranger at 3:26 p.m. I told them everything. Every detail. They listened politely. They documented it. They archived it. I resigned that evening. Weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I accessed the digitized logs remotely, searching for my own report. There was no disappearance recorded for that day. There was only a brief weather note. Fog arrived early, cleared by mid-afternoon. And beneath it, in a margin I know I did not write, a single line. Procedure maintained. My name is Colin Reyes. I have worked in backcountry tracking and recovery for long enough that patterns start to feel familiar. And when something breaks those patterns, it stands out immediately. I am trained to observe quietly, to measure distance by instinct, to read terrain the way other people read text. I do not exaggerate what I see, and I do not speculate beyond what the evidence allows. That is why what happened on that day still refuses to settle into something I can explain. The call came in just after sunrise. A hunter named Mark Ellison had failed to return from a solo overnight trip in a restricted section of state forest used seasonally for wildlife management. He had checked in with a base radio repeater the previous evening, reported his position clearly, and then stopped moving. That alone was not unusual. Hunters sometimes stop to glass for hours or camp early. What triggered concern was the radio traffic that followed. His GPS ping remained fixed within a 10-meter radius for over 6 hours, but his radio continued to transmit intermittent audio. Not calls for help, not structured messages. Just keyed transmissions that cut in and out, long enough to be recorded, then silence. I was assigned to track because of my familiarity with that specific terrain. I arrived at the trailhead before mid-morning, signed the log, checked my gear, and reviewed the last confirmed coordinates. Everything about the case suggested a medical emergency or equipment failure. No weather alerts. No reports of animal activity. No terrain hazards within the immediate area. I expected a straightforward recovery. The forest was quiet in a way that felt procedural rather than peaceful. Leaves barely moved. Birds stayed high. My radio was clear, the signal strong. I began following a hunter's known route, noting boot impressions that matched the tread pattern listed in his permit application. The trail narrowed after 2 kilometers and then dissolved into game paths and soft soil. The footprints were clean, deliberate, and consistent, indicating no distress at the time they were made. At 11:08 a.m., dispatch notified me that the hunter's radio had keyed again. The signal strength suggested it was coming from the same fixed position as before. I stopped moving and listened. There was no voice. What came through was a low, uneven sound, like breathing too close to a microphone. It lasted approximately 40 seconds, then cut abruptly. I logged the transmission and continued. As I closed the distance, the forest shifted subtly. The ground cover thinned, and the air felt heavier, like humidity without heat. I found the hunter's campsite just after noon. The tent was pitched correctly, stakes secure, zipper closed from the inside. His pack was leaning against a tree, unzipped, with supplies neatly arranged. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no animal tracks. His rifle was parallel to a fallen log, safety on. His radio sat on a flat stone near the fire ring. It was powered on. The GPS unit attached to his shoulder strap confirmed the earlier data. It had not moved since 9:42 p.m., the night before. Battery levels on both devices were still adequate. I keyed my own radio to inform dispatch that I had located the campsite and found equipment intact. While I was transmitting, the hunter's radio activated on its own, This time, the sound was clearer. It began with static, then the same close breathing, slow and measured. After several seconds, there was a faint noise behind it, like leaves being pressed together. I realized, with an unpleasant certainty, that the breathing did not match the rhythm of someone exhausted or injured. It was steady, controlled, almost patient. I turned the radio off. The forest felt louder immediately after, as if something had been muted and then released. I conducted a perimeter search, widening my circle carefully, marking trees, scanning for broken branches or disturbed soil. There were footprints leading away from the campsite, but they were shallow and incomplete, as if the person had been walking without committing weight. They stopped after roughly 30 meters and did not resume. At 1:17 p.m., dispatch called me. They asked why the hunter's radio was transmitting again. I told them it was turned off. They played back the live feed. The audio was active, and this time there was movement layered into the sound. Not footsteps, something softer, irregular. Then, very faintly, a voice. It was not forming words. It sounded like someone trying to remember how. I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with uncertainty. I approached the radio slowly, half expecting it to be exactly where I left it and half expecting it to be gone. It was still on the stone. The power switch was in the off position. I removed the battery. The transmission continued for another 12 seconds. I do not remember standing up. I remember suddenly being upright and scanning the tree line, my hand on my sidearm without consciously deciding to draw it. The forest remained unchanged. No movement, no visual disturbance. Just sound, fading into static. By mid-afternoon, command authorized a broader response. I was instructed to remain on site until additional personnel arrived. I sat near the fire ring, documenting everything in writing. The radio remained silent without its battery. The GPS remained fixed. Nothing else changed. At 4:03 p.m., my own radio activated without input. The channel was correct, the frequency stable. What came through was not dispatch. It was the hunter's voice. He was not speaking clearly. The cadence was wrong, as if the words were being assembled from memory rather than intention. He said my name once, not loudly, not urgently, as if testing whether it still worked. I responded immediately, identifying myself and requesting confirmation. There was a pause long enough that I thought the transmission had ended. Then the voice returned and said, very calmly, that he had been standing still all day and did not understand why his legs were tired. I asked him where he was. He said he was close enough to hear me writing. I did not reply after that. When the search team arrived just before dusk, the forest had returned to something like normal. The radios behaved as expected. The air felt lighter. We conducted a final sweep before nightfall and found no additional evidence. The hunter was officially declared missing at 8:11 p.m. The radio recordings were reviewed later by specialists. They found no signs of tampering, no looped audio, no mechanical explanation for the transmissions after power loss. The voice was confirmed as the hunter's through comparison with previous recordings. Everything that happened occurred within a single day. I was cleared of responsibility and returned to duty a week later. I still carry a radio when I work alone. I no longer leave it on unless I am actively speaking. I stayed at the site after the team arrived, even though protocol would have allowed me to step back once command took over. There was no practical reason for me to remain other than the fact that I had become part of the chain of evidence. I had heard the voice first. I had responded to it. That mattered, whether anyone wanted to admit it or not. The team worked efficiently, methodically. They photographed the campsite from multiple angles, bagged the radio and GPS unit, marked the perimeter, and ran thermal scans as the light began to fail. Nothing registered beyond residual heat from the fire ring and our own bodies. No human signature. No animal mass large enough to obscure one. A florist gave us nothing new. As darkness set in, the sounds shifted. Night insects took over in layers, each one occupying its own frequency band. I noticed how clearly I could separate them, as if my attention had narrowed. I kept replaying the hunter's last words in my head. Not the content, but the tone. There had been no panic in it. No confusion either. Just a statement of physical sensation that did not align with the situation. We set up a temporary command post a short distance from the campsite. I was asked to recount everything again, slowly, while it was recorded. I did. I did not embellish. I did not soften anything. When I described removing the battery and hearing the transmission continue, the room went quiet. One of the technicians paused the recording and asked me to repeat that part. I did, word for word. No one suggested a theory out loud. They did not need to. At 7:46 p.m., one of the team radios chirped. It was a soft alert. The kind that indicates an incoming signal, brushing the edge of the repeater's range. The technician adjusted the gain, expecting interference. What came through was brief, distorted, and unmistakably human. A single exhale, drawn out too long, followed by a click. The source triangulated to the same coordinates as before. We checked the sealed evidence bag containing the hunter's radio. It was intact. Battery removed, terminals covered, device powered down. My own radio was clipped to my vest, silent. No one was transmitting. Command ordered a controlled sweep outward. From the campsite, no more than 50 meters, maintaining visual contact at all times. I was placed in the second line, paired with a medic. As we moved, I became aware of how deliberate my steps were, how carefully I avoided disturbing the ground. The idea of leaving new footprints over old ones felt wrong in a way I could not articulate. At approximately 20 meters out, my radio vibrated once against my chest. There was no alert tone. Then the channel opened. The sound that came through was not speech. It was movement. Not footsteps, but fabric shifting, weight transferring. Something close enough that the microphone picked up friction. The medic looked at me, eyes wide, waiting for me to say something. I did not. I held my hand up, signaling for stillness. Into that silence a voice spoke, quiet and uneven. "I'm not lost," it said. "I just can't tell where I am anymore." Command demanded confirmation. Multiple voices filled the channel at once, overlapping, urgent. The transmission cut out as abruptly as it had begun. The forest swallowed the sound, leaving only insects and our own breathing. The sweep was called off. By 900 p.m., the decision was made to suspend active searching until morning. The official reasoning cited safety, terrain, and diminishing returns. Unofficially, no one wanted to acknowledge what had just happened. We secured the area and began hiking back toward the trailhead in a tight formation, lights angled low. Halfway out, I felt the sensation again. The same pressure behind the sternum I had experienced earlier. Not fear, exactly. Awareness. I had the sudden, irrational certainty that something was matching our pace just beyond the reach of our lights. I did not turn around. I focused on the rhythm of the person in front of me and maintained it. At 9:32 p.m., My radio keyed itself open. This time, there was no static. "Cullen," the voice said, clearer than before. "You're walking past me." I stopped. The line compressed behind me, boots scuffing softly. Someone hissed my name, asking what was wrong. I did not answer. I scanned the darkness between the trees, sweeping my light slowly. The beam revealed trunks, ferns, uneven ground. Nothing else. I didn't move. The voice continued. "You did." My radio slipped from my fingers and hit the ground. The channel remained open. No one else spoke. The team leader approached me carefully, his hand hovering near my shoulder, but not touching. The voice breathed once, sharply. Then it said, "It's getting hard to stay like this." The transmission ended. We returned to the trailhead without further incident. No one spoke during the drive back to base. I was asked to surrender my radio along with the rest of my gear. I complied without argument. I sat alone in a small office while the recordings were reviewed again, this time with timestamps aligned to our movement logs. Every transmission matched our proximity to the campsite. Every one. At 11:58 p.m., after the reports were filed and the evidence secured, I was told I could go home. I stepped outside into cool air and stood there, longer than necessary, listening. The world sounded normal again. Traffic in the distance. Wind through leaves. Nothing layered beneath it. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a voicemail notification. The timestamp read 9:32 p.m. I did not listen to it until I was inside my car with the doors locked. When I did, I heard nothing for several seconds. Then fabric shifting. A slow inhale. And finally, very softly, the sound of a pen moving across paper. That was the last transmission that day. The hunter has not been found. I still track missing people. I just no longer assume that not moving means not going anywhere. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my car for nearly an hour before driving, replaying the voicemail in my head without actually listening to it again. The sound of the pen was what stayed with me. It was ordinary, precise, the kind of noise you stop noticing once it becomes part of your routine. That familiarity was what made it unbearable. By the time I reached home, it was after midnight. I placed my keys on the counter, washed my hands, and stood in the kitchen with the lights off, listening to the refrigerator hum. I expected my phone to vibrate again. It did not. When I finally lay down, I kept my eyes open until the sky began to pale. At 6:12 a.m., my phone rang. It was command. The search was officially suspended pending review. But there had been another development. Overnight, the repeater logs flagged a sequence of transmissions that did not align with any active units. They were short, irregular, and clustered around the same coordinates. The hunter's coordinates. The signal strength suggested minimal movement, no more than a few meters over several hours. They asked if I could come in. I arrived at the operations building just after 7. The halls were quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a night shift that never quite resolved. In a small conference room, they played the recordings in sequence. There was no voice at first, just breathing, fabric, faint environmental noise. Then, about halfway through, something changed. The cadence of the breathing slowed, sensed. It took me a moment to realize what it was sensing to. Footsteps. Our footsteps. Someone had overlaid the transmission timeline with our movement logs from the previous night. Every time we stopped, the breathing paused. Every time we moved, it resumed, lagging by less than a second. When we turned, the sound shifted, as if adjusting orientation. No one spoke while the final clip played. In it, the hunter's voice returned, quieter than before, almost conversational. "I can hear you better when you're closer," it said. "It's easier to remember." The room stayed silent after the audio ended. There were no questions directed at me. None were needed. I was dismissed with instructions not to discuss the case outside authorized channels. The equipment would remain in evidence. The site would be monitored remotely. I left feeling hollowed out by a conclusion that had not actually concluded anything. Late that morning, I received my radio back. It had been wiped, reissued, tested. The technician assured me there were no anomalies. I clipped it to my belt out of habit, and immediately felt the urge to remove it. I did not. I needed to know if it would happen again. I spent the afternoon reviewing old cases, not because I was instructed to, but because I could not stop myself. I searched for patterns involving static transmissions, fixed GPS points, prolonged radio activity. There were more than I expected. Most were dismissed as equipment faults, atmospheric interference, user error. A few had notes attached, written in careful, neutral language that stopped just short of speculation. At 3:41 p.m. my radio chirped. It was dispatch, routine. A welfare check on a separate case, nothing related. I responded, kept my voice steady, ended the call. The radio remained silent afterward. I told myself that was a good sign. At 5:09 p.m., the repeater logged a transmission from the hunter's frequency. I was still in the building when the alert came through. This time, there was no confusion about the source. The signal originated exactly where it always had. No drift, no variance. It was as if something had chosen that point and refused to leave it. They played the live feed over the room speakers. What came through was not a voice. It was writing. Slow, deliberate strokes. The scratch of a pen on paper, stopping and starting. Occasionally, there was a pause, followed by a breath, then the sound resumed. Someone in the room whispered that it sounded like note-taking. Someone else said it sounded like someone trying to keep their hand from shaking. After nearly 2 minutes, the sound stopped. Then the radio opened again. "I keep forgetting what I look like," the hunter's voice said. "But I know where you were standing." No one asked me to respond. I did anyway. I identified myself, stated my location, and asked him to repeat his last known position. My voice echoed faintly from the speaker, feeding back into the system. There was a delay long enough that I wondered if I had made a mistake by speaking at all. When the reply came, it was immediate. "You're farther away now," he said. "That makes it harder." The transmission ended at 6:02 p.m. The decision was made to shut down the repeater temporarily, citing maintenance. The signal dropped across all channels. The room felt suddenly exposed, as if we had removed something structural without replacing it. No one lingered. We filed out quietly, each of us carrying a version of the same thought, and refusing to give it shape. I drove home before dark. I did not turn my radio on again that evening. I placed it on the kitchen table, battery removed, and left it there. I ate standing up. I checked the locks twice. I sat on the couch and watched the light fade through the windows. At 8:47 p.m., my phone vibrated. Another voicemail. The timestamp was current. I did not open it. I stared at the notification until the screen dimmed. When I finally listened, there was no breathing this time. No fabric. Just my own voice, played back with slight distortion. Reading out coordinates I recognized immediately. The hunter's coordinates. After a pause, the recording continued. The pen scratched again. faster now, more urgent. Then the voice returned, closer than it had ever sounded. "I can stay longer if you keep talking," it said. "It helps me remember where I am." The message ended. I powered my phone off. Nothing else happened that night. No calls. No transmissions. The silence felt intentional, like restraint. The site remains monitored. The repeater was brought back online 2 days later. There have been no further transmissions on that frequency. Officially. I still work in tracking and recovery. I still carry a radio. I have learned to recognize the difference between silence and absence. One is simply the lack of sound. The other is something holding itself still. If you ever hear a transmission from someone who is not moving, pay attention to how closely it follows you. It may not be trying to reach you. It may be trying to stay where you are. My name is Victor Hale. I am recording this because formal reports never seem to capture the weight of what actually happens in places like this, and because by the end of that day, I understood something I had been avoiding since the moment I accepted the assignment. I was a seasonal fire lookout, stationed alone on a mountain that rarely made the news and almost never made sense. On paper, it was a low risk post. No recent wildfires, like foot traffic, a single trail looping around the lower ridge. The tower itself was old but serviceable, restored just enough to meet safety requirements, staffed because protocol demanded eyes on every high point during dry season. Nothing about the assignment suggested danger. Nothing except the silence. I arrived just after sunrise. The road up the mountain was gravel and poorly maintained, the kind that forces you to drive slowly and listen to every sound your vehicle makes. Pines crowded the edges, tall and dense, their tops swaying lazily in the wind. The radio crackled once as I passed the last marker before the ascent, then went quiet again. That didn't concern me. Radios behaved strangely in elevation, and I had learned not to read into minor inconsistencies. By the time I reached the tower, the sun was fully up, the sky clear, the forest spread beneath me like a textured map. I remember thinking how peaceful it looked from above, how orderly. You can mistake distance for safety very easily. The first thing I did was log my arrival time and run through the standard checklist. Generator fuel levels, backup batteries, binocular calibration, weather instruments. Everything checked out. The tower creaked slightly when the wind shifted, but that was expected. Old structures always complained a little. I brewed coffee on the small propane stove and stood by the windows while it heated, watching the tree line below. That was when I noticed how still everything was. Forests are never truly quiet, even when you think they are. There's always something: wind through needles, insects, distant birds, the subtle movement of leaves. That morning, there was nothing. No birdsong. No wind. Even the trees seemed frozen, their branches suspended in a way that felt less like calm and more like a paused frame. I checked the instruments again, half expecting to see some explanation in numbers. Pressure change, incoming weather. But everything was normal. I told myself it was early, that wildlife sometimes settled after dawn, that my ears were adjusting to altitude. Rational explanations are easy when you haven't been given a reason to doubt them yet. At 8:17 a.m., the silence broke abruptly. Birds erupted from the trees all at once, a sudden chaotic burst of sound and motion that made me flinch. Wings beat the air, calls overlapped, and then just as suddenly, it stopped again. The forest fell back into that unnatural stillness, as if nothing had happened. I wrote it off as a predator passing through, something that startled them into flight. It was plausible. It was also the first entry I made that day that wasn't strictly procedural. By mid-morning, hikers began checking in over the trailhead radio channel. Two men, early 30s, experienced by their own description, planning a half-day loop. I acknowledged their transmission and reminded them to check back before descent. Their voices were clear, relaxed, carrying the casual confidence of people who had done this many times before. I marked their call sign in the logbook and went back to scanning the horizon. Around noon, the silence returned in full. Not gradually. It was as if a switch had been flipped. One moment there was wind against the tower windows, a faint rustle in the trees. The next, there was nothing. I remember the way my ears rang in response, the faint high-pitched whine that comes when the world goes too quiet. I leaned out the open window, half expecting to feel the breeze on my face, but the air was completely still. Even my own breathing sounded too loud. That was when I noticed movement on the trail below. At first, I thought it was just shadows shifting as cloused overhead, but the sky was clear. I raised the binoculars and focused on the switchback near the eastern slope. Two figures were standing there. The hikers from earlier, I assumed, though they were farther along than I expected. They weren't moving. They stood side by side, facing uphill toward the tower. From that distance, I couldn't see their faces, but something about their posture felt wrong. People don't usually stop like that, in the middle of a trail, not without adjusting packs or pointing something out. They were too still. I keyed the radio and called out to them, using their call sign. No response. I tried again, checking my transmission strength. The radio emitted the usual static burst, but there was no reply. When I looked back through the binoculars, they were gone. The trail was empty, the bend below them clear of any sign they had been there at all. I told myself they'd moved on, that the angle of the trail had hidden them from view. Still, I logged the observation. Not because it violated protocol, but because something about it bothered me enough that I didn't trust myself to remember it accurately later. At 1:42 p.m., the emergency beacon pinged. It wasn't a full distress signal, just a brief activation that immediately cut out. Those can happen accidentally, faulty equipment, a slip of the hand. But it was unusual. I checked the coordinates. They matched the eastern slope, not far from where I'd seen the hikers earlier. I attempted contact again, cycling through frequencies. This time, the radio responded with something I didn't expect: open, channel feedback, like a microphone left on, but beneath it there was a sound that didn't belong. Breathing, slow, uneven, too close to the receiver. I froze, listening, every muscle in my body tense. I called out again, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. The breathing stopped. The channel went dead. Protocol dictated that I report the beacon activation and prepare for a potential search escalation, but something stopped me. It wasn't fear. Exactly. It was the growing awareness that the mountain itself felt different, heavier somehow, as if the air had thickened. I stepped away from the radio and walked to the opposite window. The forest below looked unchanged, but the silence was deeper now, pressing in on me from all sides. Even the tower's usual creaks had ceased. I checked my watch. Time seemed to be moving normally, but it didn't feel that way. Each second stretched, weighed down by the absence of sound. I tried to focus on routine tasks. Anything to anchor myself, but my attention kept drifting back to the trail, to the empty space where the hikers should have been. At 3:06 p.m., I saw them again. Only one this time. He was standing at the base of the tower's access stairs looking up. I recognized his jacket immediately, a bright color that stood out against the muted greens and browns of the forest. He didn't wave. He didn't move. He just stared. I leaned out the window and shouted, my voice echoing off the metal frame. He didn't react. The silence swallowed my words whole. I started down the stairs before I could stop myself, driven by training and something more instinctive. Halfway down, I realized the forest sounds were gone entirely. No wind, no insects, no distant birds. Even my footsteps on the metal steps sounded wrong, muted, as if the air itself was absorbing the noise. When I reached the bottom and stepped onto the ground, the man was gone. There were no footprints, no disturbed leaves, no sign anyone had been there at all. I stood there longer than I should have, heart pounding, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Heat exhaustion, visual misinterpretation, stress, all reasonable, all insufficient. When I finally returned to the tower, the radio was already crackling. The trailhead operator asking for a status update on the hikers who had never checked back in. I looked out over the forest as I responded, my voice steady despite everything. From above, the mountain was perfectly still, unnaturally silent, as if it were holding its breath. And the day was far from over. By the time I finished the radio exchange with the trailhead operator, my mouth had gone dry. I gave them the facts in the most neutral way. I could manage hikers overdue. Last known position on the eastern slope. A brief beacon activation with no follow-up. I left out the breathing. I left out the way one of them had been standing at the base of my tower less than 10 minutes earlier. Some details don't sound credible when you say them out loud, even to yourself. The operator acknowledged the report and said they would initiate standard escalation if there was no contact within the next hour. Their voice carried the faint background noise of an active office. Phones, footsteps, distant conversation. And for a moment I clung to that. Sound like proof the rest of the world was still functioning normally. When the transmission ended, the silence back in so abruptly it felt physical, like pressure against my ears. I forced myself back into routine. I logged the incident times precisely double, checked coordinates, recalibrated the weather instruments, even though they hadn't changed. Everything I did was deliberate, methodical, an attempt to impose order on a situation that was starting to slip beyond it. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second too loud in the absence of anything else. At 3:38 p.m., the silence deepened. I know that sounds impossible, but it's the only way I can describe it. The earlier quiet had felt like an absence of sound. This felt like something actively suppressing it. Even the clock stopped ticking. I stared at it for a full 10 seconds before realizing the second hand wasn't moving at all. My watch still worked. My phone still showed time passing normally. Only the clock had stopped, as if the tower itself had decided to hold still. I stepped outside onto the catwalk, scanning the tree line with binoculars. The forest looked wrong. Not visibly altered, but subtly distorted, like a photograph taken with a lens that wasn't quite aligned. Depth felt off. Distances were harder to judge. I focused on the eastern slope again, half expecting to see another figure standing there, but the trail was empty. Then I heard it. A footstep. Not on the stairs, not on the catwalk, but below me in the trees. One single, deliberate step, followed by another. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Crunching leaves and snapping twigs. It moved slowly, unhurried, circling the base of the tower. I leaned over the railing, straining to see through the branches. Nothing moved. The footsteps continued anyway, each one measured, precise, as if whoever, or whatever, was making them knew exactly how far apart to space them. I grabbed the radio and keyed the mic, calling out again. My voice tight despite my effort to keep it calm. No response. The footsteps stopped immediately. The silence snapping back into place like a door slamming shut. I stood there, radio still in hand. Every instinct screaming at me to retreat inside, to barricade myself if that was even possible. Fire towers aren't designed for defense. They're open, exposed, all windows and thin walls. You can see everything, which usually feels like an advantage. In that moment, it felt like a liability. At 4:12 p.m. the emergency beacon activated again. This time it stayed on. The signal was steady, pulsing at regular intervals, broadcasting distress loud and clear. I checked the coordinates. They hadn't changed. Still the eastern slope. Still too close for comfort. I attempted contact immediately, switching frequencies, adjusting gain. The radio crackled, then settled into open channel again. There was no breathing this time. Instead, I heard something worse. My own voice. It came through faintly at first, distorted by static, but unmistakable. The same words I had used earlier, when calling out to the hikers, played back with a slight delay, stretched and warped. I froze, listening as the transmission repeated itself, not looping exactly, but fragmenting, pieces overlapping out of order. When it reached the point where I had said their call sign, it cut off abruptly. I shut the radio off. The silence that followed was absolute. Even my own heartbeat felt muted, distant. I backed away from the equipment slowly, every movement careful, controlled. Panic wouldn't help me. I knew that much. I had been trained for isolation, for stress, for emergencies. This was just another situation to manage. That's what I told myself, over and over, even as the light outside began to change. The sun dipped behind the western ridge faster than it should have. Shadows stretched across the forest floor, lengthening at an unnatural pace. Dusk settled in thick and heavy, the sky darkening to deep purples and grays. I turned on the tower lights, their glow casting familiar shapes across the interior. It helped a little. Familiarity always does. At 5:01 p.m., I saw movement again. Not at the trail this time, but closer. Too close. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, partially obscured by branches. I could see the outline of a head, shoulders, the suggestion of arms hanging at the sides. It didn't move. It didn't sway. It was like a cutout, placed deliberately at the edge of visibility. I raised the binoculars, hands shaking despite my efforts to steady them. The face was wrong. I won't pretend I can describe it clearly. It wasn't deformed or monstrous in any obvious way. It just didn't fit. The proportions were off. The features arranged in a way that looked almost human, but not quite convincing, like a poorly rendered image. The eyes were open, unblinking, fixed on the tower. I lowered the binoculars, my stomach twisting. When I looked again, the figure was gone. I didn't leave the tower after that. I locked her door, even though I knew it wouldn't stop anything determined enough to reach me. I kept the lights on as the darkness thickened outside. The forest beyond the windows dissolving into a black mass broken, only by the occasional glint of starlight. The emergency beacon continued to pulse on my equipment display, a silent visual reminder that something out there wanted to be found, or wanted me to come looking. At 6:23 p.m., the trailhead operator called back, asking for an update. Their voice cut through the silence like a lifeline. I answered immediately, reporting no contact, worsening conditions, requesting SAR activation. They acknowledged, said teams were mobilizing, estimated arrival times. Hearing that help was on the way should have brought relief. Instead, it filled me with a growing sense of dread. Because as the transmission ended, the forest outside finally made a sound. It wasn't wind. It wasn't wildlife. It was a low, sustained hush, like a breath being released all at once, rolling across the mountain in a slow wave. The trees shuddered, leaves trembling without moving, branches quivering in place. The sound rose, peaked, and then cut off sharply. The emergency beacon went silent at the exact same moment. I stared at the display, my reflection staring back at me from the darkened screen. The mountain had gone quiet again, deeper and heavier than before. And I understood with growing certainty that whatever was happening out there was reaching its conclusion, and that I was still very much a part of it. The clock started ticking again at 6:41 p.m. The sound was so sudden I flinched, spinning toward the wall as if I'd been struck. The second hand lurched forward, then continued normally, each tick sharp and distinct. I checked my watch, then my phone. The times aligned. Whatever pause had taken hold of the tower earlier had released it. And the return of something so ordinary unsettled me more than the silence had. It felt like a concession, a way of letting me believe normal rules were back in place. Outside, night fell quickly. The last band of twilight dissolved behind the ridge, leaving the forest in complete darkness. I shut the remaining blinds and focused on the interior, keeping my back to the windows as much as possible. The emergency beacon display remained dark. No signal. No coordinates. The absence felt deliberate. At 7:02 p.m. the radio came on by itself. There was no initial burst of static, no warning tone. It simply activated. The channel opened, the speaker emitting a faint hiss. I didn't touch it. I stood perfectly still, listening. For several seconds, there was nothing but low, level noise. Then a voice emerged, quiet but clear. Victor. It was my name, spoken with the correct cadence. The same way I usually said it when introducing myself over the radio. My throat tightened. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The voice repeated my name once more. Closer this time, as if the distance between us had shortened. I reached forward and turned the volume down until the sound disappeared, then switched the radio off completely. The tower plunged back into silence, broken only by the hum of the lights and my own breathing. I pressed my palms against the table, grounding myself, forcing my thoughts into order. Hallucinations were possible. Stress-induced auditory phenomena were documented, especially in isolated environments. I recited the explanation internally until it almost sounded convincing. At 7:18 p.m., I heard footsteps on the stairs. They were unmistakable. Metal on metal, slow and methodical, ascending one step at a time. I moved to the center of the room, eyes fixed on the door. Fire tower stairs are exposed. Anyone climbing them would be visible through the windows, silhouetted against the faint starlight. I saw nothing. The footsteps continued anyway, drawing closer with each step. When they stopped, the silence returned, heavier than before. The doorknob didn't turn. There was no knock. Instead, Something pressed against the door from the other side. Not a push, not an attempt to force entry. Just pressure, steady and patient. Like a hand resting there, feeling the shape of it. I backed away until my shoulders hit the far wall, my heart hammering so hard I was afraid it would give me away. A shadow slid beneath the doorframe, thin and elongated, stretching across the floor toward me. It didn't match any shape I recognized. It bent at angles that didn't correspond to a human body, tapering and widening in places that made no sense. The pressure against the door eased, and the shadow withdrew, slipping back into nothing. I waited for a long time after that. I don't know how long. Time had become unreliable again, elastic and strange. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I checked the windows one by one, scanning the darkness outside. The forest was invisible beyond the immediate glow of the tower lights, a void swallowing everything beyond a few feet. No movement. No sound. At 8:03 p.m., a new light appeared below. It wasn't a flashlight. It was too steady, too diffuse. A soft glow bloomed among the trees, pale and colorless, illuminating trunks and branches without casting proper shadows. It moved slowly uphill, drifting rather than advancing, following no trail I could identify. As it drew closer, I realized it wasn't a single source but several, scattered points of light converging toward the tower. I counted them. 1, 2, 3. Then more emerged from the darkness, until there were too many to track individually. They surrounded the base of the tower, their combined glow bathing the ground in a dim, unnatural wash. Within that light, shapes began to form. Human silhouettes, featureless and still, standing shoulder to shoulder, all facing upward. I recognized jackets, packs, gear, the hikers, not just the two from earlier, but others as well, their equipment mismatched. Styles from different seasons, different years. Some stood at impossible angles, heads tilted too far back, necks stretched as they stared at the tower. None of them moved. None of them made a sound. The silence pressed down harder than ever, thick enough to feel. One figure stepped forward. He was closer than the rest, standing directly beneath the stairs. The glow revealed his face clearly, and I felt something in me fracture when I recognized it. It was one of the hikers from that morning. His features were intact, his expression calm, almost neutral. His eyes met mine through the window, and for a moment, I thought he might speak. Instead, he raised one hand and pointed. Not at me, but past the tower, toward the dark stretch of forest behind it. The lights flickered. In that instant of dimming, the figures shifted. Their outlines blurred, overlapping, rearranging themselves in ways that made my vision swim. When the glow stabilized again, the crowd was gone. The forest below was empty, dark, silent. The lights vanished entirely, plunging everything outside into blackness. I sank to the floor, my legs finally giving out. I don't remember deciding to sit. I just remember being there, my back against the wall, my mind struggling to process what I'd seen. Training, logic, rational thought, all of it felt inadequate. Whatever rules governed this place, they weren't the ones I'd been taught. At 9:11 p.m., the radio crackled again. This time I answered. I don't know why. Maybe part of me hoped to hear a human voice, something real. The trailhead operator came through, tense and clipped, reporting that SAR teams had reached the lower access road but were experiencing communication issues. Radios dropping out, GPS malfunctioning. An unnatural quiet reported by multiple personnel. They asked if I was safe. I looked around the tower at the thin walls, the locked door. the windows staring out into darkness. I said yes. It was easier than explaining the truth. The operator told me to stay put, that teams would reach me by morning. I acknowledged the instruction and ended the transmission. The radio stayed silent after that, finally obedient. Nothing else happened for the rest of the night. No voices, no footsteps, no lights. The forest remained utterly still, as if exhausted by whatever had taken place. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting with my back against the wall, eyes fixed on the windows. When the first gray light crept over the ridge, the world seemed to loosen its grip. Birds began to sing, hesitant at first, then louder. Wind returned to the trees. The mountain breathed again. SAR reached the tower at 7:26 a.m. They found me exactly where I'd been all night. They found no trace of the hikers. No footprints, no gear. No sign of the lights or the figures. Officially, the hikers were declared missing. Unofficially, the mountain was marked as anomalous. The tower scheduled for decommission. I left that day and never went back. The reports say the disappearances stopped after the tower was abandoned. Maybe that's true. Or maybe the mountain simply learned it didn't need a watcher anymore.